welcome. I hope you're going to find this of some help. So this is, if you like, a free CPD video. You can hopefully get some learning out of it or some understanding, build up a strategy for your own approaches. So it's about reflecting and reviewing a piece of work, and what we've done is to look at the what's wrong with osteopathy commentary as a means of understanding how we can track along as we're doing some form of reflection on a piece of work. So, as I said, we're trying to help you in article review, but in order to help you, we've got to give you some understanding of philosophical stances, epistemology, and so on. And it's hard to get your head around those things, and I'm hoping that using an illustrative dynamic will help you to sort of pin these sorts of concepts into your own thinking a little bit more. So it is necessary, but it sometimes feels very far removed from osteopathic practice. And also the following talk does disclose some of my reflections on the work under review. So this type of literature analysis is something that we do in the CNMO, College of Non-Musculoskeletal Osteopathy, which is a postgraduate college giving internally validated programs for osteopaths. We do this sort of thing a lot, especially in the second year of our diploma programs and also in our research mentoring programs. So, you know, there's lots of depth that one can apply to all of these things, and this is just a little bit of an introduction, so it's not meant to be a full treatise on the whole story. But a lot of talk has been generated around this recent article or commentary, What's Wrong with Osteopathy, and there are lots of strategies which we can use, and I've used some here today, and when interrogating the work, there are clearly lots, but this should get you going. And then along the way, you can decide for yourself what you think of, for example, the academic and professional worth of this particular work's positions and so on. So there's lots I could say. There are lots of things here which need deconstructing ultimately, and to follow everything which is ultimately necessary will take you an awfully long time. So I'm not going to follow through every single point. So of all of the points I've noted, I've just picked up a few. But it will, as I say, the purpose is to help you form a strategy for formulating your response, or how you internalize this sort of commentary, make use of it, and move forwards either with it or from it. So there's an abstract, obviously, into this piece of commentary by Thompson and Macmillan. This commentary critically examines the foundational assumptions, practices, and claimed distinctiveness upon which osteopathy was built and continues to be structured. So in the first instance, you ask, have the authors understood these foundational assumptions? Have they understood the way osteopathy continues to be practiced based on those assumptions? And do you agree or disagree with them? And if you want to understand on what they're basing their comments and to attempt to understand why they're making those comments, we need to explore further. So they say they're examining foundational assumptions, and they say that osteopathy is, they take a certain view of what those assumptions are, and then they say that osteopathy was built on those and then continues to be structured on them. So all of those, if you like, subpoints within that statement from the abstract can be interrogated. Then they move, if I pick up some stuff from the conclusion, they argue for a reconceptualization of underpinning theories, assumptions, and associated skills, which is informed by current evidence and knowledge from disciplines outside the osteopathic domain. So there's a purpose as to why they've put this commentary out there. Either that they think that, so there are these underpinning theories which they've identified. Now, either they think those theories are very damaging to the profession, or the authors are concerned that there is undue attention paid to what they see as those theories, which they don't appear to identify with, or which they feel they have proven, along with other authors, and they've proven that those theories are false or inappropriate. So there's some conclusion that they've come to about the effect of leaving those theories as they've identified them in place. So if you think those theories are damaging, if there's a real concern, is there actually a real concern? Do you agree that it's damaging, or is it an understanding on their part and in fact no threat is in fact present? So what would your view be? So are these things that they identify as so problematic, is that correct? Have they shown in what way they're problematic, or have they actually reasonably identified those things? Because if they haven't reasonably identified them, but then say they're problematic, that is a problem in itself. So if they have, for some reason or somehow, constructed an idea of these underpinning theories, which isn't actually ultimately relevant and also isn't actually damaging, if that's the situation, if either one of those situations, but they're still trying to portray it as somehow a problem, if that's the dynamic, is this whole commentary merely a cry for help from a small section of the osteopath academic world who fail to either adequately research or understand osteopathic practice in the wider community? And if so, should you accept the work or reject it? So, you know, who have they researched to come to these conclusions? How many people was it? Was that representative? Have they ignored other forms of literature about osteopathy? And, you know, you need to then look at how they've constructed this whole sort of story in the commentary, if you like, to see whether it's reasonable or not. So you have to hold all of these sorts of questions in your head as you go through, because you're going to have to frame your position in relationship to that. One thing it does seem to me to be, though, is that there's no reference to the fact that they take a stand from the outset that they value osteopathy. There doesn't seem to be anything in there at all. They don't seem to value osteopathy. There's nothing in their words which comes across as valuing its knowledge base. And it appears that they feel all osteopathic knowledge has no truth, as there's no evidence for it, or that the evidence disproves it. And if they have different views, it's not apparent in what they've written. So we're going on what they've written. And certainly there seems to be little valuing and respecting of you know, the practice of osteopathy in that. That's my view. That's what I'm taking from my reading of their work. Now, there's going to be a whole host of things that we can look at about how you look at whether something's reasonable, how you can prove whether it's truthful, or, you know, have they come to their conclusions logically? And there's going to be all sorts of things about evidence and truth and paradigms and epistemology in this talk. But I just wanted to call up a quote so that if you're going through a critical appraisal of something, this work does seem to imply that they have indicated quite strongly that there's no evidence for osteopathy as practiced by many osteopaths, and that there is some other separate evidence and knowledge that should replace osteopathy. And this seems to be quite an absolutist sort of stance. They've already decided that their position is a strongly reasonable one. But if we actually look at what Karl Popper says, he said, in point of fact, no conclusive disproof of a theory can ever be produced. So essentially, I think they feel that so much of what they say is drawn from work that disproves osteopathy. But in fact, that disproving isn't categorical. So whatever they're saying, it's always somewhat inconclusive, because, as Popper says, no theory can be conclusively disproved. It's always possible to say that the experimental results are not reliable, or that the discrepancies which are asserted to exist between the experimental results and the theory are only apparent, and that they will disappear with the advance of our understanding. So if you insist on strict proof or strict disproof as the dynamic about you must do evidence-based practice, that is essentially an insistence on this very strict proof in the empirical sciences, you're never going to benefit from experience and never learn from it how wrong you are. So there's a caution for everyone in this. And again, there could be lots of things one could say about Sackett and evidence-informed practice as opposed to evidence-based practice, and the reasonableness of all of these stances. But anyway, let's park that bit for now. But I think to be too certain of your position is always a bit shaky. So looking overall, what are they saying? Let's just try to take a sort of get a grip of the whole thing. So taken as a whole, the article seems to imply that most, many, some osteopaths are sticking to somehow the wrong things, sort of my paraphrasing, because their knowledge is either false or has been surpassed, or and accordingly practice must alter. So what that actually is a call to deny those osteopaths a refuge in theories and principles that are to be eliminated as they damage the profession. So osteopaths practicing according to traditional osteopathic practice and principles are doing something inappropriate, wrong, unfounded, whatever the right word is, and that really is a problem. And so they want to eliminate the problem by saying that that foundational practice, or even the current practice based on those foundations, should be replaced. So now that's quite strong. Okay, but anyway, let's park that. Now, the authors, though, seem to imply that this is merely a debate. This is rhetoric. We're calling for, we just want to raise conversation because, there doesn't seem to be much, which I think, in fact, is also wrong. But, they're taking a rhetoric as though, there's no agenda and there's no politics involved here. I don't know. Is this piece mere rhetoric? Why is it important that they write this work now? I mean, beyond the call for input from the IJOM, a couple of years ago about, what's going on in osteopathy. So why are they writing it in this manner now? Is it encompassing of all of their views, or is it not representative of their views? In fact, they have other views, but they're just using this as a vehicle for comment. In which case, what about the impact? If you write a thing, there's going to be an impact, and how is that considered in terms of reasonableness? So what's the evidence from what they've written that they've considered that this might have any form of challenging impact? And I don't know, this is something else to think about as you're going and reading through. It also essentially seems to portray the idea that osteopathy has not progressed since an early American phase, and there's no development as there is in other professions, and there's no critical review of what these sort of early American-based and contextually derived principles are. And they're saying anyway that because principles have changed a lot, if you say you're adhering to principles, and which ones do you mean? And because you're taking one set of principles as opposed to the other, therefore it's all a nonsense if all of these principles are not anyway agreed and static, and holding onto any one of them is also nonsensical. Anyway, that's another thing that you need to reflect upon as to whether you agree or disagree with that sort of statement. Then other things that are apparent in the sort of general sort of narratives around these types of papers is that, some of the criticisms about osteopathic principles, such as the body is self-regulating and self-healing. Well, see, that's not osteopathic, one could say. And lots of people say that the body and physiology is about self-regulation and biofeedback and all this sort of stuff. And that's got essentially nothing to do with osteopathy. But it's what osteopaths do with the concept of the body as self-regulating and self-healing that is the osteopathic part. The phrase, the body is self-regulating and self-healing, is not actually the defining illustration of what osteopathy is. So it's what osteopaths do with that. And I'm not sure that there's been sufficient analysis of that. Anyway, they also say that when we look at sources of information, we need to look at the epistemology or the context of what we value, where we got it from, and how is it that we know these things. So that there's a complex set of dynamics, and they're saying that essentially they've taken early osteopathic thought, and then regardless of whatever's gone on since, they've then taken a view, an epistemological view of that early work. And again, do you think that's reasonable? Now, they do seem to say quite consistently by inference or direct words that osteopathy is biomedical, and that so that this is a negative thing, and that having anatomy and physiology or a discourse around these things within osteopathic practice and being a large part of osteopathic practice, because these things are biomedical ideas, that is what makes osteopathy biomedical. So just saying that osteopaths study anatomy and saying that we have an interest in anatomy and the form of the body and so on, it reduces this to mere biomedicalism. I think that's not reasonable. So just stating it isn't the same as it being so. So anyway, they're saying, as we'll come back to, it's just anatomy, they're saying, that osteopaths are doing, and that the world's moved on from just anatomy as a cause of disease, and that practice shouldn't be about sort of intervening on the patient in a direct way. Practice should be some other role, which we'll get onto. And they're saying that osteopathy is biomedical because it's saying that illness is a result of structural imbalance only, and that disease can be cured by moving the body, and that is a reductionist idea, and that's biomedical, and that they don't see any discussion about coping with the experience of a condition from the perspective of the patients, and that's because that doesn't include that. Well, they don't see it being included, which again is another contentious point. They say that reinforces the idea that osteopathy or osteopaths are biomedical. And so they're questioning, if you like, the depth or range of the clinical engagement in osteopathy. And if it's supposed to be all things to all men, but we're only doing anatomy, how can you square that circle, as they might phrase it? And they would say that the biopsychosocial bit in practice is very small, which they find problematic. And we don't spend as much time with the economics of the patient's world, their environment, their social aspects, as we do with providing the hands-on. So we should do less hands-on so we can do more of the other things. So we could be providing a role which is providing all those other things. And that's the key. They want us to adapt the role. So given that one could dispute all of the dynamics around whether their description of why osteopathy is biomedical is reasonable or not, they say, well, essentially, we want you to change practice. Anyway, so that's the message I'm getting reading between the lines. Another message I'm getting is that, if illness comes from the body and we have the knowledge about what to treat in the body, then we're going to treat you, which is paternalistic and an uneven relationship with the patient. And so essentially they're saying that if we're interested in anatomy and we think anatomy has got something to do with why disease develops, essentially we are then going to end up being paternalistic to our patients, ignoring them and just delivering stuff that only we think is reasonable and only we can actually deliver. And so I think there's lots of problems with all of that sort of thing. And this idea of mono-interventionalism being reductionist, therefore biomedical and paternalistic, I think that's a very challenging argument to make. And my reading of this work is that they haven't made that logic fall through. So they're saying anyway that if you just do hands-on, you're putting all your eggs in one basket and you're ignoring all the evidence around manual therapy, and that it's ineffective, it's non-specific, it's unreliable, and it's unsound to use just that one unreliable intervention as our main intervention. So in amongst all of that, one actually then has to accept that the evidence around manual therapy being ineffective is proven. Is it? I think there's a lot of questions. I think there's been a lot of very bad research which has then been used as though it portrays a very strictly made and truthful point. And I think there are holes all over these sorts of stories. And so I actually don't think that the evidence around manual therapy is what they say it is. So that's a point of dispute. But yeah, going through literally all of that in this talk is not what I'm going to do, but that can be another talk. But it certainly seems to be somehow clear that they don't like a profession that is relying on hands only. It's an incomplete profession for them in the face of the idea that other things improve the patient better or more effectively. Okay, so they've got a view that there is some evidence which shows that some things work, and they feel that that's better evidence than the other stuff. So again, this is all relative, but they say that, you know, at the moment, that stuff trumps this stuff, and so therefore we should abandon all that stuff and do this other stuff. And again, because research dialogues and dynamics go along all the time, and because really good research into the hands-on stuff hasn't been done well across the board, you simply can't say that the other stuff is better research, because the research base is still incomplete. So to say that you need to move on from the manual interventions on that premise, I think is flawed. But anyway, as I say, these are some things that you can reflect on as to what's built up to them framing their commentary in these ways, and what's led to them, you know, building up to this dynamic that they've identified these 5 themes which are so problematic. So there's clearly more underpinning what they say than the mere words in the commentary. And so I'm much more interested in what's led them to where they are at, because I think their cultural context, their social community, and their practice communities and their professional communities have led them to be perhaps having a view which, if you're in the community of osteopaths but not in their subset of the community wishing to move towards other groups, you could say that their views or interpretations aren't perhaps reasonable, and so therefore their call for action may in fact not be reasonable. We're going to come back to all of that. So why now is it a continuum? So this work is about saying that if theories are outdated, then osteopathy must become something that it was not originally, and thereby in the call for inclusion of evidence from other professions, the implication is that osteopathy must be essentially replaced. So you must replace the osteopathy bit in osteopathy practice with those other disciplines. So, you know, it seems to me that it's coming across as replace. Are they actually arguing for inclusion? You know, inclusion might not be so problematic, but replace, is that what they mean? If they are saying something akin to that, is such a radical position reasonable and valid? And if they're arguing for inclusion and just adding bits on, then this is a debate about what wide health roles osteopaths can play. by adding elements to practice. Now that's a completely different debate, because that's about what are the health roles that osteopaths aren't playing, which is not at all the same as what's wrong with osteopathy. I think there's quite an important distinction there. And so this current debate based on, oh, what's wrong with osteopathy, as though osteopathy is assumed to be the thing, if what they're really saying is just bolt on some stuff, then all of the debate and narrative created by such works is an unnecessary one. And anyway, there's quite a lot of evidence that osteopaths are already doing all the stuff that they're saying that you should bolt on, because they're saying, we see that you're not doing it, but you could point to an enormous body of work which says, actually, sorry, but we are already bolting on all of those things. You know, some of us may bolt it on better than others, but, you know, it's there in current practice. So, you know, actually, there's nothing to add on. What are you on about? What are you actually calling for here? What's the point of your work? So it's not the osteopathy that's the problem in that sort of dynamic. It's, you know, are the wider health roles that osteopaths can play, is that the debate? And I think in that sense, then, is this work misdirected? Should they have been a lot clearer? Should they be, in fact, internally a lot more clear about what's going on? Because certainly we can look, anyone else can look from the outside and sort of pick through underpinning agendas as we might, you know, see them, and it's important that we reflect on where all this is heading. So, you know, healthcare roles, healthcare practice, and the place of osteopathy in a health system. These are all perfectly legitimate questions. Should osteopaths be performed to train many? Should osteopaths be trained to perform many roles? Well, there's no reason why not, but not to the extent that it removes the osteopathic skill sets and knowledge from an osteopathic scope of practice, nor the desire to research this contribution to healthcare practice. So if one takes the view that the osteopathy hands-on part, the traditional concepts, whatever, has not been sufficiently currently researched and explored, if you take that view, which I do, and if you take the view that evidence that it doesn't work is incomplete, poorly done, and unreliable, if you take that view, which I do, and then you take the view that actually there is some quite interesting emergent scientific rationale for an enormous part of osteopathic dynamics, which I do, and I don't think that there are these implausible mechanisms threaded through the whole and entirety of current osteopathic practice. You know, what started out as one idea about how, you know, things worked, you know, has naturally moved on, and there are, I think, considerable plausible scientific rationales for what osteopaths do with their hands-on part. I think in the light of all of that, there is no reasonable call actually for the removal of the osteopathic skill sets and knowledge and the education therein, so that I think it's important to keep those things there, so to enable the research done on what many osteopaths are doing in practice. Anyway, so reflecting on wider health, social trends and cultures, and, you know, the emergence of biopsychosocial medicine, which is now moving on anyway, you know, none of the reflecting on all of that and adding bits in is not anathema to osteopaths who identify as osteopaths. But as I said, a call for the removal of the core part of their beliefs, I think, should be considered unnecessary and unreasonable. And I don't think that they've made the case, or I don't think that there is a strong case, ultimately, that it should be removed. So if that is their intent, then I think it's reasonable to take a position against it. But again, we're just trying to unpick what one could make of what they're saying. So anyway, for some in the profession, if as much energy was put into researching osteopathy as looking for and training people to attain health role portable skills to support a high demand health system such as the NHS in the UK, then there would be even more evidence than there is already to refute the assumptions made by and the threat posed by this type of commentary. Anyway, let's keep going through the work to see if clarity can be gained on any of these dynamics. So the osteopathy part, is the osteopathy truthful? Does it have a body of knowledge? What's that knowledge based on? And to get to grips with these things, one has to consider philosophy. So it's at this point that everyone groans, but, you know, bear with me on this. Let's see if we can find a way through. So, you know, osteopaths know some stuff. How do we know it? And is that knowing reasonable? Are we just making it up? Are we just inventing it? You know, can our knowing be of something reasonable? So how do we get to knowledge? So she's spelling knowledge wrong, but there you go, whatever. This is all about epistemology. So we need to understand a bit about epistemology so that we can review the work in question, because we can all have a different epistemology. And so usually in academic dynamics, someone will have a position from which they argue a point, and then you might share that position. You might have a different position or an epistemology, and so you might want to think on how you would counter it from your dynamic. Is what they say reasonable across many positions, for example? And whose position is the right one? It's ultimately what it boils down to, isn't it? So the authors have made a series of propositions, which we'll come back to. The authors imply that what they say is true, or at the very least, very strongly founded. So you are invited to consider that their propositions are very reasonable. So is it? Are they strongly founded? Are they reasonable? So how can we trust what they say is true as opposed to our own position or view if it's different to theirs? So this is what your epistemology and types of things get to you. So knowledge can be defined as something you're familiar with, and an awareness and understanding gained through experience or study. But truth is a state or quality of being true. So it's in accordance with facts or reality. So actually knowledge and truth are not the same thing. So the key difference between knowledge and truth is that truth is always based on reality, whereas knowledge can sometimes be based on falsehood. So the traditional knowledge of osteopathy is essentially false, and the truth on the reality as they've identified it is where they're coming from. So it seems that they're articulating the dynamic that the knowledge osteopaths hold is based on falsehood or inappropriate or no longer relevant foundations. Is that a reasonable thing to conclude or to say or whatever? So essentially this commentary is about challenging truth and knowledge, because that's ultimately you know, it becomes quite political at this point. But anyway, the authors state with this idea of the propositions that they make, these 5 problems that they've identified. With this in mind, they state, with this in mind, we also suggest possible directions for development to make the problems identified less wrongs for osteopaths and for the profession more generally. And they say, look, osteopaths and osteopathy is not unique in this regard, and other professions face similar challenges. But then they go on to say, however, to concoct arguments and whataboutisms detract from the focused, critical self-reflection needed for osteopathy to develop and mature as a contemporary healthcare profession. Now, let's stand back. Lots of other professions face these challenges, but it seems to be that it's only osteopaths. They're singling out osteopaths as having no appropriate response to a call for self-reflection, and that only they, the authors, or people like them using self-reflection are capable of such behaviours. They're seeming to, my reading of what they're saying is that, you know, there's something wrong, you know, we're trying to help you, dear osteopaths. But all you're doing back to us, dear osteopaths, is using ad hominem arguments and to arguments. And again, it doesn't matter if I'm pronouncing that wrong. They're saying osteopaths are, that is the reaction of osteopaths to someone saying, there's problems, we're trying to help you. And I just don't think it's reasonable to put across the idea that all osteopaths do that. I don't think that's right. I don't think there's really any reasonable evidence that that is what osteopaths collectively, all of them, are doing. Only doing that. Only sort of, you know, criticising the authors only and not criticising what they say, because that's what these things are. On what basis do they take that position? And you know, one could say that that's pretty dreadful and patronising, and it puts no value onto osteopaths and their practice. I think that you could reflect on their words in that way. So whatever they're writing in the article, you know, whatever the merits of what they have considered proven or not, you know, whatever else they've said, just that part themselves, I really don't consider that this is a reasonable position or comment to make. I just don't think so. But anyway, you may disagree. That'll be up to you. That is the whole point of trying to deconstruct what's going on. So, you know, who or what's trustworthy and what's their sort of value system. And as I said, it becomes a little bit about politics and then about power. So you know, they're essentially, you know, they're in a position of power. They're making powerful statements, and then they're saying that essentially osteopaths aren't either educated enough, trained enough, self-reflective enough to do anything other than try to say, oh well, you know, whatever. So if, you know, take the view that you're not as well trained academically, take the view that you know, you've been in practice and haven't had the chance to explore all of these very complex issues as fully as some others have, and if that makes you somewhat confronted and you react in a certain way, should your reaction be taken as meaning that your position, your own position, is in fact unreasonable? So if, you know, somebody is defensive, it may be because they don't have the skills in rhetoric that other people have been honing and sharpening rapier-like for a long time. And so is it reasonable that you know, throw that lack of skill back in people's face without actually considering what, you know, those people whom perhaps are defensive are really thinking? Now, I guess the whole point of this commentary is that they feel that they've asked enough questions, they know enough, they've made their opinions, their conclusions. Here is what they are. But I think they've based all of that on such a small body of work. I just think it's not reasonable, and it's also not valuing the position and development of many people in the profession. And I don't think that's ethical, reasonable, moralistic, and whatever dynamic to. I don't think that's a good stance to come from. So, but anyway, you know, someone saying you are using ad hominem stuff, I think, and just leaving it there, I think is just doing the same to you. It's a form of dismissal. Okay, so you're invited to do what they say because they have valued through their comment. They have put strong positions which you are invited to accept, essentially at the face value which they say them. So that's going to be a problem propositionally, as we'll see. So as I said, I don't think it's all osteopaths do this sort of thing a lot, and I think that when you are putting up some counterpoints, and if you're trying to work through what you're going to say in response to either that point or the 5 problems that they've identified in this particular commentary, for example, you've got to consider why they're using that stratagem. Why are they making those comments? And it ultimately, why relates to power and hierarchy. And so I think that looking at why, and then looking at how they've come to their positions. So if you consider their points as propositions and philosophical positions, we can look at their logic, their bias, any misquoting, any misconstrual, etc. And this is not criticizing them, but their work. And so the authors state that they're using critical theory and social we. So if we start to look at their author position, their author bias, all of those things, those are in fact not ad hominem type of dynamics. They are appropriate critical appraisal. So it's on that basis we'll proceed. So validity and truth. So knowledge and truth are different. So they've made various sort of propositions or statements, and they make them as though they're truthful. So they make individual propositions, and then collectively, validity refers to the relationship between propositions. So a single proposition isn't in itself valid. So a proposition can be truthful, and then you can use logic to see if it is or isn't truthful, or if the logic falls apart. And it's when you put a number of truths together that you get increasing validity, for example. So where are they coming from? What position are they using? Are they using more than one position? Would we use a different one ourselves? So what are these things called positions? What is the philosophy behind it all? So there are usually sort of 3 main branches of philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. So metaphysics is about essentially what's real. Now, metaphysics isn't experimental. So you can't provide an experimental proof about something metaphysical. So metaphysics deals with stuff that, if you like, science can't get through, work around, or there's no experimental proof for. So metaphysics is one special branch. There's a thing about ontology within that, and ontology is different to epistemology, which is a different branch of epistemology. So anyway, metaphysics is one thing. Now, epistemology in the middle is something which ultimately you can gather through reasoning, gather through observational experiencing, and using lots of ways of getting at knowledge. So there's lots of epistemological ways of knowing that we can consider. And then axiology is something else. So axiology about like, what's right to do, what's about ethics and aesthetics and stuff like that. So people usually in healthcare can take quite an epistemological position. There can be lots of different types of epistemological positions, which we'll come to. So usually we can reside within epistemology without essentially worrying about whether it's right or whether there is any other existential dynamic that we could be operating in. And we can't in this particular talk about whether in fact osteopathy resides in a different metaphysical dynamic or not. We are going to look at it through the lens epistemologically, and I think that's obviously where they're coming from. They have an epistemological position, and so within that we're going to see. So there's no argument about right or wrong. It's just about constructing knowledge in a certain way. So epistemology. Now, as one example of knowing, there's been a particular position taken about, well, we know a lot about osteopaths' views, how they practice, how they identify, how they conceptualize themselves. The authors essentially are portraying that they know a lot about this. And they've come to the positions they have because they've looked into it deeply. Now, one of the things that they're using to cite and as a basis to indicate that they've deeply considered it is that they have looked at a section of the osteopathic profession and found it essentially wanting. So who have they looked at? So in their search for knowledge, they've gathered knowledge about osteopathy from a bunch of osteopaths. How many? 12. So this is one paper, but for example, one paper that they are using underneath all of this is that they looked at 12 osteopaths, or Thompson, Petty and Moore looked at 12 osteopaths. Now, these were academics and they were all clinic tutors and they all had common perspectives. Now, as the authors admit in those papers relating to that study, what they found is not generalizable. But nevertheless, this sort of research seems to have emerged as then having been generalized and is then forming all these opinions and propositions about the nature of osteopathic practice. So they seem to have concluded stuff, and they've concluded it strongly, they say, meaning that it should be reliable, and it's quite truthful accordingly. They've based it on far too narrow a population sample, and such qualitative inquiries as was used in such studies are really can only ever be representative of the sample studied, 12 clinic tutors. We're going to come back to this dynamic. So if you say, right, I haven't done a study specifically on just 12 osteopaths, if I'm part of the community of osteopathy and I've looked at a whole bunch of grey literature and social media and I've recoursed to the wider osteopathic literature beyond, for example, this study, and I've looked at that literature and discourses, and that reveals that many say that, in fact, that reveals, I think, that clinic tutors from a few osteopathic educational institutions in the UK, not all of which, most of which are men, are not in fact representative of the entirety of the osteopathic ontological position, nor of the epistemology and knowledge base. It doesn't frame the knowledge of osteopathy. It doesn't define, they can't define the osteopathic epistemology. And as we'll see later, I think that this is what the authors are trying to claim based on a really very inappropriate sample. You can't draw those sorts of conclusions from the works they're citing. Now, the point being, in this sort of commentary, they have chosen to cite some works to back up their position. If they have a whole bunch of other works, and why didn't they cite them? But they've chosen their citations presumably carefully, and so one would presume that the quality or nature of those citations chosen would be sufficient to back up their propositions. And so, as we'll come back to see, that perhaps that's not the case. So, as I say, in this study, only clinical tutors from 3 out of a possible 9 institutions in the UK were represented. I don't know how many schools there are globally in the non-American MDDO model, but there are very many, many more. But anyway, and those participants, 7 of them came from one institution. 4 came from another one, and 1 came from a third. So it's in fact quite a narrow dynamic, and they all had different either degrees or diplomas, or they'd had extra things or came from other careers. So they were quite a mixed bunch, but nonetheless, so they had an age profile to them. But most of the people questioned, say 6 of them, were aged 41 to 50. 3 of them were 50, and only 3 of them were 31 to 40. So what's the age split in the profession as a whole? And I'm not sure that's representative of that either. But also, interestingly, one can comment about the fact that again, most of the years in practice that people had, they looked at many people whom most of the people who had quite a long time in practice. And is that the demographic of the profession as a whole? I don't know, have to look it up. But anyway, again, one can see if it's representative. But if we took just the point that 2 were female and 10 were males, that is simply not representative in any way of osteopathic practice. You know, not in the UK, not globally. So I don't think that, so whatever the merits of that particular research project was, its strength is not that it's representative. So the opinions of the interpretations of the comments of a non-representative sample of osteopaths in the UK cannot be used as a generalizable dynamic. So then anyway, let's move to the sorts of things that they're saying in there. And I think if you do delve into, for example, Thompson's thesis on what that article is based, there is within that a picking out of all sorts of data points. You know, this person says this person says that would indicate that this is a theme, blah, blah, blah. So that's, you know, a constructed phenomenological sort of, you know, dynamic. And yes, that's fine, that's fair enough. But they have constructivist means that they acknowledge that there's multiple realities. They found that even that non-representative sample has lots of multiple realities. Now they've evidenced that in this own work. I say they, I'm probably using, you know, they in a wrong way, but there we go. I think what seems to be going on is that although they found something like, oh, osteopaths are patient-centered and osteopaths are not patient-centered, what they're doing then is subsequently picking elements of what they've published and portrayed. They're picking elements of it to take it forwards. In taking that forwards, they've come from a constructive dynamic to find all these multiple realities amongst these 12 osteopaths. But then they're choosing to emphasize just one of those realities moving forwards. Therefore, that takes them into a positivism and position on the realities of others. I've got a little chart in a minute to help you see where I'm trying to come from in these dynamics. So because in the What's Wrong article, they seem to be saying that essentially osteopathy is part of a positivistic paradigm, essentially biomedicine being just anatomy, it becomes part of that positivistic stance. So they're saying that they're constructivist, but osteopaths are positivistic, and essentially. So I think that it seems to me on a number of occasions that they've picked parts or not fully portrayed bits which they themselves have previously published in order to essentially deny a plurality, to then pick on one and then use a critical position to argue for a change in practice based on that one that they've then chosen to portray, whereas they know through their other published works that that is not representative. And you cannot, as I say, cry for change on that sort of unfounded reality. So they seem to be cross-paradigming within this thing, and again that sort of comes across in the ableist discussions in works by Macmillan, which we'll come back to. So in all of this iterations of their considerations over time and through various papers and works, are they constructing a reality of their choosing, or are they really reflecting what's there? And if they're trying to reflect what's there, they have to be ongoingly truthful in the sense that they have to portray that plurality, not just say it's actually only one. So anyway, this is a bit of a chart, and so that there are lots of positions. Like there's a positivism position, which is perhaps like in biology and mathematics, it's very, you know, particular. There can be a post-positivistic view, which is you know, psychology and so on. There can be a constructed multiple realities and many people in different social ways, and that knowledge is a human construction and we've all got to share it, whereas in a positivistic thing, things are logical, they should be experimented, you can detect it with surveys, and you know there are facts about it, and it resides a lot in biology. And then things like a critical view, which they're taking in the article, is that its criticality is about power relations, and it's about difference in race and gender and class, and it's when parties come together there are lots of tension, so you critically appraise that, and that knowledge is value laden and political, and so they're looking at things like social justice and transformative, sort of values underpin them and all that sort of stuff. So it becomes all politics. So I realize most people don't want to get lost in all of these things, but it's something which helps one see that if they're being critical, then they're realizing that there are tensions. If they've constructed something, though, and they've identified something as being of multiple realities, they then can't say that, in fact, a certain thing is represented by positivism, and so they can't prove that it's biomedical by, for example, saying it's osteopathic, anatomistic, and the anatomy is out there, and it's not, and that the osteopath or the knower is separate to the anatomy, the anatomy's in the patient. So if these are the sorts of things that they're trying to say osteopathy is, they're trying to place osteopathy in a positivistic framework, whereas they have already said it's not. For example, they found osteopaths, they've used construction to say that osteopaths in fact construct their own approach to practice in a number of different ways. So these are my readings of their sorts of collective works and the works that they refer to. So you can't have it both ways. So anyway, when you have these sorts of things, if you have like a positivistic thing, it's all naive, and you can use experiment, you can deduct things, and you can say that you can prove through evidence that this is or isn't a thing, and therefore you can hopefully disprove it, and therefore saying that practice based on that paradigm is unreasonable. So that, in fact, they're trying to draw on evidences about the inter-rater reliability of palpation being not proven. They're trying to use that form of evidence in a positivistic paradigm, experimental paradigm, to say that osteopathy as a biomedical practice is inappropriate. So they're proving it through positivistically derived experimental approaches, which in fact is unreasonable if they're saying that osteopathy can be a constructed, interpreted thing, because if you want to do that, then you would need to have all sorts of other sorts of evidences to either help you understand osteopathy and osteopathic knowledge. And so they should, if they're saying that it should be or could be this, they can't then actually use simply experimental dynamics to say that the version of osteopathy that they're testing against that is therefore unfounded. So can their position, the position that they take, although there are all these fancy names and you don't need to remember them, they've taken a position but then are using other, they're making conclusions based on that, and I don't think that they're or one needs to reflect on whether in fact they're mixing, matching, muddling, and therefore ultimately constructing a strong stance that is not in itself able to be substanted in the way that they're trying to go for it. So again, critically appraising their work using a critical theory lens means that we have to dissect their work in certain ways, and I'm trying to illustrate how some of those ways might be. It's not all of the ways, but some of the ways. Now, anyway, they're saying that we need to understand the osteopathic epistemology. We need to understand the osteopathic knowledge. We need to understand what it's based on. Is it all reasonable what it's based on, and so on. But in this work, for example, this thesis to determine ultimately what an osteopathic epistemology might be made of, they in fact didn't ask those 12 osteopaths if they did in fact have an epistemological position anyway in the first place. They discussed and interviewed and inquired with them, and then determined from that what examples of epistemologies might be that those 12 people held. But I'm not sure that they then went back to or asked in the first place about those osteopaths' original epistemological position. So I do wonder, if it's supposedly so important, why that wasn't done, or if it was, why it wasn't recorded, and if it was recorded, I can't necessarily see it. So, but anyway, I think that's just really interesting, and we can reflect on that further. But anyway, I'm just trying to, as I say, go through a few things. So, osteopathic epistemology is supposed to be how we derive at our clinical practice, how we gather information. So if we have an epistemological position osteopathically, then there are ways in which we're supposed to be deriving knowledge and using it. So this then comes down to ultimately your clinical practice, how you perform your clinical analysis, and how you come to your decisions about what you do with people, and where you draw that knowledge from. Are you drawing it just from their body, or are you drawing it from all sorts of things? So essentially they've been doing bodies of work and so on, and they, through lots of different works and so on, trying to understand characteristics of osteopathic practice. And they seem to be, through that work, saying that those people who have described what they've described, those osteopaths have discussed certain things which the authors have labelled traditional osteopathic theories, and that they are saying that the nature of the narrative and discourse, the analysis therein, indicates examples of reductionist thinking, technical rational approaches, and inherent biomedicalism. So they're saying that that's what they've identified, and that's how they're labeling it. Okay, so they may, in their view, they found it, and in their view, they've constructed that theme. And it is worth questioning whether their construction is appropriate. Would someone else have made that construction based on what those people said? And again, I think, one could dissect that further, and it's probably worthwhile trying to dissect that further. But anyway, so each time we're looking at something that's, some words in the commentary, what's their meaning, where are they getting that from, how have they constructed that, so to speak, and tracing it back to the citations they've used. Now, in those citations, we look through it, we look at the value of that work that they've literally cited, and in that work, we then track also back through those citations that work has cited, and we just see what it's all based on, whether it's really based on some really good stuff, some really robust stuff, some really generalizable stuff, from really well done studies, from lots of different samples and so on, so that we can have a meta understanding, and or is it just a house of cards? So you have to sort of go through that sort of thinking, because it does seem to be that anyway, that on a number of occasions, that practice has been characterized as patient-centered, collaborative and empowering, and that not all osteopaths are having a practitioner-centered thing. Many are, if they're practitioner-centered, others in fact are not that. They are collaborative or empowering. So already they acknowledge that a number of their sample were not practitioner-centered. And when you essentially go through all the quotes of what people said, person 1 said this, person 12 said that, persons 2, 4, 5, 7 and 9 said this, the theme about what they say is this, you know, patients or persons 1 and 12, they said this, and that then means this. You'll actually see that by the time they keep coming up with different themes, from, you know, an initial reading, it seems that many of the people contained representations of all of these things, and that neither one was exclusive. None of them seemed to be, from what was portrayed, exclusively one or the other, or it was all very muddied as to whether in fact you could claim that. So actually all practice seems to be, even from that non-representative sample that was studied in this particular paper, that they're using as part of the foundational train of thought to get to the statements that they have made in the commentary, that they have acknowledged that you can't reduce any person's practice to merely being anatomistic, biomedical, reductionist, and therefore implausible and inappropriate. I just don't think it stacks up, but you can read through all of that and you can see what you make of that and see whether in fact they have, you know, been well founded. You can take a view. So with all of these ontological positions and epistemology, then, you know, if you take one position, there's going to be a thing here. So lots of different types of truths. For example, there can be an intuitive truth, your quiet internal voice, your gut feeling. It's a subconscious source. You can take a moral type of truth, and looking at fairness and right or wrong, and that's a conscience. And you can look at emotional truths and their immediate and current desires, and it's about feelings which can achieve a critical mass and bubble up. And then you can take logical forms of truth and you can reason through them, and you can follow different lines of reasoning, and there's a justification, and axioms and propositions can be a source of that. Then you can take a scientific form of truth, and this is persistent detection through the experimental method. So data and the scientific method is the way that you get at that form of truth. You can have a utilitarian, altruistic, pragmatic type of thing about, you know, what just works better. And, you know, you can use cost benefit analysis, saying it's cheaper and it's easier and that type of thing. And that's a form of truth and a source of truth. Or you can have experiential types of truths whereby you internalize and you understand through internalization and have a wisdom, and it's the source is the laboratory of your own life, and especially your formative years. And so when you take positions, ontologies, epistemologies, and all sorts of things, if you look through one lens, you'll find one thing. If you look through a blue lens, you'll find one thing. If you look through the red lens, you'll find one thing. But if you look through other lenses, there can be other equally valuable truths and knowledge that can be identified. So if you take a position and you gather that from your position, you're going to find certain things. But if you study osteopathy through a different lens, the epistemology of osteopathy that you find, or the practice that you identify, will in fact be different when viewed through that lens. And so you have to view practice through a number of different lenses to make such sweeping statements as, or to consider whether such sweeping statements as osteopaths are biomedical, that this is an untrustworthy position which should be changed. In fact, you know, there's a lot of research out there from different lenses, which seem to show that that vision of the osteopathic epistemology is not the general view. So the practice cannot be and is not captured by the methods of Thompson through sampling only a subset of osteopaths. But if that's the way you use that information, then it's right to call into question the points you then make based on that. And there are many in my experience, you know, and you know, you could say, oh, that's just your opinion, Caroline. Okay, fair enough, say it. But anyway, my opinion and other sort of works and things. So there are practitioners who derive their work and knowledge and understanding by using methods of knowledge formation and acquisition which are derived from a different ontological position, other than this logical, scientific, epistemological dynamic. And even if you say that knowledge, even from within the one scientific, you know, position, if you are going to confine yourself to that, knowledge is derived from many sources, which is not acknowledged in the what's wrong work. So then I think the whole thing, as I said, becomes then a question of power and control. And then, you know, if you're you're concluding that these all things are wrong and then we need to change them, then you're saying something needs to be emancipated, something needs to be liberated, because something's wrong, the power is not wrong, and we're going to exert power and control to emancipate what they consider the right view of osteopathy is, or to basically get rid of that view, emancipate us from a view which is incorrect. So this is the critical theory stance. But as I say, if one can see that their positions are not stacked up on, it's right to consider not whether critical theory is the wrong lens per se, but if they've decided that position is truthful or strong, and you can see that it isn't very strong, then you need to call in question as to what is the nature of emancipation. You know, how wrong is it, in fact, and is it in fact as problematic as they say, and is an emancipatory stand, a critical theory stand, relevant, actually? So that's what one was trying to say earlier. So these things of taking an epistemological stand do then filter through into what you're trying to say. And if you then have a sort of glimmer of understanding of these things, you can be better placed to see where they're coming from, what they're trying to do and what they're trying to achieve, basically. What's the underlying agenda in all this? And then you can frame your reactions accordingly, and you may not feel so defensive because you can see more about the reasonableness of the conclusions that they've come to, and that might empower you to be able to see all of that. So that would be useful. So you can continue to dig into all these dynamics, and I have just although I've talked through it a little bit, put just a couple of snapshots in about, you know, participants 1, 2, and 3 said that, you know, whatever the numbers are, I'm not reading them right, but they've identified that a certain number of people have an epistemology of practice knowledge which emphasizes propositional knowledge, they say. Then they've said that there is an epistemology of practice which is collaborative and etc., and which is not this propositional knowledge. And I'm mentioning this because they're then taking propositional knowledge, which is a more positivistic view of knowledge, and that clinical examination is done by applying technical skills and that propositional knowledge, meaning then that it is a certain nature of practice, and they don't like that certain nature of practice because they're saying it then excludes all sorts of things that they feel should be included. And they're saying that if they're doing a propositional, technical, rational approach, then they are focusing their examination on patient's body, and it not then excluded, and they are thereby excluding the person. And so this exclusion of the person, they say, is problematic, which it may be, but they have said that some do that, but not all. They already know that many osteopaths of their sample have said that they do utilize a patient-centered dynamic, not a practitioner-centered dynamic. So therefore, to just continue to subsequently go on about stating that osteopaths, essentially all osteopaths only do propositional knowledge, but biomedicalism and is practitioner-centered, to just pick it out and say therefore that proves it, is not a reasonable view, I think. Now, just momentarily on practice knowledge and expertise, they mention very briefly in some parts, you know, expert knowledge and what osteopaths do or should do, and that they've studied that, so therefore they know about it. And they saying, yes, that, you know, some osteopaths do this and some osteopaths do that, but they're then essentially honing in on osteopathy as a propositional process. And they're saying osteopathy is a propositional process. That's what they seem to be saying. And then they're saying that osteopaths should be aware of the fact that you need to do more than that. And that if you were a registered osteopath and you chose to remain registered when registration came in, when statutory registration came along, we all agreed to do certain standards of practice, which said that, you know, you had to practice in a certain way, which was much more about having a practice expertise. And it should be about moving on from just propositional based practice. Now, if you look in the general theories about practice knowledge and expertise, actually, people understand that knowledge, clinical knowledge, the knowledge that clinicians bring to the clinical encounter, it's a primary feature of the therapeutic intervention, and that this knowledge takes three forms. Yes, propositional, but professional practice knowledge, and also personal knowledge accrued from life's experience. So if you look at how knowledge is used in the clinical domain and what that knowledge could consist of, there has been an enormous body of work which says that, yes, it needs to be all of these things. And so that when you need to develop your individual clinician, you also have to enable, so that to facilitate knowledge use in clinical practice, it means also enabling knowledge generation through clinical practice, and that you have to refer through to knowing, declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, and then conditional knowing knowledge, which is what you get from your accrued life experience knowledge and your professional practice knowledge. So you have to derive knowledge from a number of sources. So practitioners need a lot of sources, and it's, if you say some practice is only propositional based knowledge practice, then your clinical practice essentially falls down. So I think that what they're saying is that some osteopaths have a clinical practice based only on propositional knowledge, and I think that they're then using that to say that, well, propositional knowledge only is wrong, and you shouldn't just use that, and that practice based on propositional knowledge is not appropriate clinical decision making. But I think when you look at what has been studied about how osteopaths use clinical decision making, it is clear that osteopaths use more than just propositional knowledge. So other authors and other works seem to say that you can't just pick out that part of their work and then criticize their whole practice based on the fact that they use that part. If the practitioners use a range of things, including propositional knowledge, then that is not a problem, because it's the way they put it all together that is what makes clinical dynamics important. So just having a pause there, thinking that the recording had stopped, but I think we're okay. So I think that in their works, they do know that osteopaths, not all osteopaths, only rely on propositional knowledge, but to then critique osteopathic practice as though it were only made up of propositional knowledge is to deny their own knowledge of that practice. Seems a bit mad. And anyway, I think that when you look at the different types of knowledge that is used, so these three types of knowledge, such as, there's a nice discussion here from Tonelli et al. So experiential knowledge in clinical medicine, its use and justification. So you've got propositional stuff, then you've got, professional stuff and experiential knowledge. And they're arguing that primary experience represents a kind of medical knowledge which is distinct from the propositional knowledge produced by clinical research. So when you research bits and pieces, you can find little bits of evidence about bits of propositional knowledge, but that there is something else in experiential knowledge, which is a necessary part of the trifecta. There's something else in there, which is then crucial to determining the best diagnosis and course of action for a particular patient. So it's absolutely critical in clinical discourse and clinical medicine that practitioners use and are able to use and are understood to need to use this experiential knowledge. Now, I'm highlighting that point because I think that there is a particular type of osteopathic knowledge which is outside of propositional anatomy, push here, pull there, technical knowledge of how do I HVT this or rub that. There's something else that osteopaths have as a source of knowledge, and it's this experiential knowledge which others outside the profession say is critical in determining the best course of actions for patients in general. And I think that osteopathic knowledge is embedded in our hands-on work. It is about palpation, but palpation is not quite the right word, as we'll see. But palpation, if I can use the word just for the moment, it is a primary experiencing, and it is a distinct form of medical / osteopathic knowledge. Literally, the hands-on is the uniqueness. It's not trying to determine uniqueness out of the propositional push here, pull here, anatomy is this bone, that bone stuff. You're looking at the wrong sort of knowledge. If you're then just saying that your knowledge should be not just procedural, but professional practice, knowing how to do something, and having knowledge from a variety of sources, know how to do something, how to be sensitive, how to be inclusive, how to be empowering, that type of knowledge. If you need all of these things, you have to allow that there is another form of osteopathic knowledge which is not determined by A and B, which is what, for example, has been identified in earlier works. I feel it's not just A and B, but C, which comes from this touch story, which is really important. So I think that when you're looking at knowledge and you're trying to say you know what it is, if you haven't really looked at this thing about hands-on, then you can't say you have an understanding of osteopathic epistemology. Now, it might be actually that they feel that this palpatory hands-based thing has already been, by others, dismissed as completely unreliable, and so on. There's many things which have been used to say that palpation is unreliable. As I said, I can't go through the whole lot here. That'll be another video at some point. Iterated reliability. Shoulder surgery, if you look at tissues causing symptoms, which is supposed to be part of that, palpation is unreliable, and it's biomedicine because you think that the tissue in the back or the disc or the knee is the thing which causes the pain, and obviously it isn't, because pain perception is based on the fact that you owe too much on your mortgage, so that's biopsychosocial, and it's got nothing to do with the osteopath rubbing the back and all this sort of stuff. So I think that there's a whole body of debate and conversation which now has been going on for quite a number of years in osteopathy and in manual medicine, which seems to say that based on, for example, the way that physios and surgeons use touch and the way that influence has seeped into some osteopathic educational institutions' teachings. So they're, in fact, perhaps teaching things which are not taught, or they're not doing it in an osteopathic way. That's a whole other conversation. But anyway, if there's this whole other body of conversation, supposed evidence and supposed identification of the truth that palpation is unreliable, it can't be used in clinical thought processes, it's not relevant, should be removed. I think that they're completely misunderstanding the type of knowledge that palpation and palpation isn't quite the right word. They're completely misunderstanding this really significant part of the osteopathic epistemology, and that actually, if you want to consider right from foundational works all the way through, this type of osteopathic knowledge is from a different ontological position, and therefore the epistemology, the type of ways that you access that knowledge, come from a different methodological construct. But anyway, the way that osteopaths are using supposedly touch or palpation or whatever is about what it's the osteopathic interpretation of the hands-on work is that it is within them. They are experiencing it and making use of it through what they experience within when they touch. It's not out there, as in there's a bit of body and there's a touch onto that bit of body. Osteopathy, as can be understood from earlier works, is that it is an experiential dynamic. And so in that context, it has to have a practitioner-centeredness about it, because it's about what the practitioner experiences, because that's how they determine what to do. Now, that does not equate to a denial of the patient version of practitioner-centeredness, which is the implied propositionally, which is that implied propositional sort of thing, or that they're trying to say that traditionalists or traditional osteopaths are in fact delivering. They're trying to say that traditional osteopaths use touch to prod bones and put them back into place, and that's because of the practitioner idea about what should be done. And that's therefore you are being paternalistic and ignoring the patient. But actually, if you take a view that the event in the patient's bodies is then an experiential dynamic between the two, and that the choices and decisions in clinical practice and the knowledge about what is reasonable in practice is about what the osteopath has experienced when they do the act of the hands-on. If you understand that it's experiential in that sense and that there's a value and purpose in that, then you're going to realize that it is a profoundly important part of osteopathic practice. So, for example, how many times have you picked up a body and you think, actually, no, that's not going to be right. That's not going to be the thing to do. Osteopathy is about being sensitive to those concerns, and that sensation comes from your internal perception of what you've just experienced. So there could be all sorts of things that you can take here, but none of this is referred to at all. It seems to be that in using such things as if physios can't have inter-rater reliability, and that if you just crack people up, then, low back pain is no better 10 years later. All of those things don't really either explore the hands-on part of osteopathy nor actually dismiss it. But there's been this whole construction over, 20 years, 30 years now probably, of the fact that palpatory dynamics in care has been proven to be unreliable, and it has been dismissed. So essentially the authors are making use, they don't go through any of those arguments, but they're making use of it in them coming to their positions in identifying these 5 problems. So I don't think that they can capture what they feel they've captured. And I think that they're missing something really important, that in their constructed osteopathic epistemology and practice dynamic, it's failed to explore a whole host of things, which is explored in part by some other people in some other literature. They're not referring to it, but they're taking then all of that as generalized. They're critiquing that generalization, and all of that is a ever decreasing circle of something which can't hold up. But as I say, I think they're conflating some dynamics to fit with certain constructs, and that they're imposing it, and other authors are imposing this construction through ongoing repetition and quoting each other and so on, and they're putting this certain narrative in, and perhaps doing it regardless of any consequence, or do they not worry about the consequence, or do they anyway? But again, it seems to be that the work is put across as rhetoric. We just want your view. Have a think about these things, dear osteopaths, because you've obviously got so much wrong. You do need to think about things, and we're just helping you. I think, as I've already said, that whether there in fact is issues of power, culture, position, social practice, and identity, and all of these things embedded within their positions, I think it is right to use that lens against what they're doing, to look at what they're saying. So where does all this sort of practice angst come from? So they must have got these views from a whole variety of places. So you could ask, where have they got all these views come from? So we've discussed, some aspects of where they could have got these views from. And a lot of the work seems to be studying students, taking views of tutors who deal with students, or tutors that perhaps have then gone on to do other things, and as that caused them to practice their practice their original practice. So there's certainly people are being revealed as having uncertainty, and having questions which don't appear to have been appropriately answered. So essentially, they've taken positions and they're saying, please answer us. Nobody's answering us. We haven't got anything answered. So therefore, there can be no answers. So therefore, let's move on from those positions. So, if you looked at it through their eyes, you could think that that's a reasonable, point to reach. But if they're looking at students as being if students' uncertainty in the fact of what they're learning because tutors aren't representing it to them well, or not clearly, or those tutors were taught by people whom were taught by people who didn't have a good understanding, or whom had uncertainty themselves, and that those people had an uncertainty in their own teachers. If many people were students become teachers, those teachers teach new students whom in themselves become teachers and then pass on everything, then that vulnerability is essentially passed on. So identity crises, where your teachers are ever more and more removed from discourses about perhaps very early ontological positions and knowledge dynamics. If you become very, very removed over the course of a few iterations of tutors and students, then yes, I think it's quite reasonable that people have become struggling, and that they seek reassurance, or they seek certainty from somewhere. And if they're getting it from outside osteopathy, then it's natural that they would identify with that more. But because they're gaining security from their insecurity through those methods, that does not mean that the original ontological positions of Still and the nature of his practice, etc., have been disproven. They may be uncertain about them, but that was not the same thing as then proving that those positions are therefore disproven. So, in fact, if the schools aren't teaching things well, and are you using the outcomes of studying students and practitioners taught in that system? If you're using the outcomes of studying those students and practitioners taught in that system to actually explore osteopathy, and then you are finding supposedly osteopathy wanting, are you merely testing the effectiveness of the teaching of the relevant institution? So are you merely saying that osteopathy doesn't seem to be well expressed and everybody's uncertain about it? And is all you're proving merely that you're bad at teaching it? You could ask that question. So who is then responsible for the practice that is so criticised? Seems to be that the work is stating that it's the osteopaths that are at fault. and they need to be corrected, whereas perhaps surely fault lies within the institution. Or, you know, at least some of the fault must lie with the institution rather than its product. So who should be reflecting is a question you could ask. So the poor ongoing teaching and the lack of value placed on the ongoing teaching of any form of sophistication in palpation and its place in clinical practice it certainly seems evident that is going on, that there is less teaching, there's less importance placed on teaching it, because the people orchestrating you know, those whole curriculum dynamics, surely the debate within those institutions, within this sort of debate, within those sorts of institutions has led to the fact that less hands-on is included in curricula in those institutions. So I think that you know, for many reasons, not just through the What's Osteopathy article, not just through those authors' own works, but through the multitudinous numbers of works, which, you know, I posit are perhaps not as good as are claimed. All of those things have meant that there is then a move away from hands-on and a I feel misdirecting of osteopathic practice and dialogue towards something, unnecessarily towards something. So if you looked at this epistemological, this special osteopathic hands-on thing, let's look at that. And then when we look at what their works say, their works don't just say, oh, osteopaths use anatomy. If you must focus on anatomy, thereby by default you're being biomedical. I don't think it's clear that in reading those osteopathic texts that the direction to reflect on osteopathy was about being biomedical in that context. That those early osteopaths were talking about what you can see when you envisage the anatomy in the patient, what you see when you view the anatomy and physiological partnership in that patient, in that time, in their mind, body, spirit continuum. In other words, within their environment as well. What those osteopathic texts, early texts, are directing you to do is to consider what you're going to make of it when you come to feel it. It's perceptual. So primary palpatory experiential knowledge is from a different ontology to medicine because it includes from within, and it's a different application of phenomenology, in fact, because experiential things are phenomenological. You're looking at a phenomenon within you. That's an application of phenomenology, which is different to the application of phenomenology that is advocated by the authors, for example, because they're saying you should use much more qualitative dynamics, perhaps using phenomenological dynamics to look at patient-centeredness, because you use phenomenology to understand the patient's experiences of having osteopathy done. And they're calling for it because they're saying it's not really done. In fact, it is, but anyway. But that's not the only use of phenomenology, and that in fact there is a different application of phenomenology, that which is to consider the nature of osteopathic practice, looking at how we are considering this dynamic of anatomy and physiology, this interrelatedness, this self-regulatedness, this ongoing activity in the patient, which we're trying to understand. If we're using touch to understand that, because that's what Still, etc. is directing us to do, Still and Littleton and others direct us to look at that. This is completely different. So phenomenology, for example, studies all aspects of the world as they subjectively appear to us, not as they are. We look subjectively at things, but we're looking at the way that things come into a type of being, into an existence, that is enhanced by our interactions with those phenomena. So the patient has something going on. Excuse me. We're implored to consider what's going on in the patient through the lens of anatomy and physiology, but that lens does not finish at the understanding of anatomy. It can then only come through a much more wider phenomenological experiences of what we are, so what we're interpreting the phenomena that we experience to have meaning with respect to the physiological processes, mental and emotional, mind, body, spirit, environmental dynamics within the patient. We're using them as a lens through which to understand all of that. The authors separately, I think, probably may contend that that's just implausible to try to feel all of that through all of that. But in the moment, one is needing to understand that osteopaths are generating knowledge based on the phenomena they experience, which will have a reality in the patient. But the phenomenon that we're experiencing, there is an aspect of what our knowledge is about, is from the phenomenon that we get, and then our interactions with that phenomena and our understanding around how we're constructing our intention to engage with the patient based on all of that. So when you want to get into all of this, there are lots of people taking a different position, and if you want to look at the works of Bortoft and Goethe and many others that follow in those dynamics, and others in osteopathy such as Walter McCone have also tried to have discourse around this. There is a lot to say about knowledge generation through from this phenomenological dynamic that is very relevant to osteopathy and the way it was originally practiced, because what was originally practiced was not what is now claimed to be what those original osteopaths said. It is not, based on what's said in these early works, practice is not doing what, okay, many osteopaths might have come to do, which is doing a push-pull type, I'm just going to direct you, I'm just going to sort of do it, and that sort of thing. If osteopaths have ended up doing that, in fact, that isn't what these early texts saying, and the authors are trying to quote bits of the early texts to prove the fact that those early texts directed current osteopaths to do just push-pull nonsense. But I don't think that actually even their reading is reason. I think it's quite easy to see that their reading of those early texts is of insufficient depth, and again is a bit of cherry picking if you try to show that essentially osteopathy is merely the study of anatomy, and it's anatomy based in a biomedical perspective, leading to a push-pull paternalistic, ignoring the patient type of approach. And in fact, I think that you can strongly argue that what osteopaths did was not use palpation. Osteopathy utilizes a perception event, and there is a huge narrative by saying that if osteopaths palpate, if that's what they did, then palpation is a passive, mechanistic, philosophically dead external thing, and it's separate from the active absence dynamic about what you're engaging with within the patient. Now, what people like Estevez and so on would have talked about an inactive inference, this therapeutic alliance and dialoguing, they're using it through, if you like, a verbal lens and maybe touch to promote a conversation, but they're saying the inactive inferencing comes from the consideration of the patient-centered dialoguing, whereas what early osteopaths are trying to say, and what other philosophers trying to interpret what early osteopaths have said, what they're saying is that there is another form of active engaging, looking at things, looking as a way of looking at things, and I'm not going to explain this very well, that you know, it's not what the objectification of palpation actually is. The osteopathic way of looking through hands-on is to observe different things. And different things is about having an active consciousness and reasoning from that at the centre of osteopathy, developing a perception of living anatomy in the imagination. And this is a phenomenological approach to health care. But that's not saying that then that's merely subjective and has no clinical utility, but trying to unpack that is a big conversation. But I'm hoping to perhaps have shown you that there are lots of different ways in one can consider what the what's wrong positions are actually all about, where they've come from, and do you think they are as strong and as reasonable as the authors are portraying. Anyway, so let's just come back a little bit. And I think it is clear that they're not discussing metaphysics. They're sticking quite epistemologically about knowledge. They're taking a certain perspective on knowledge, but they are not mentioning something axiological. They seem to be placing certainly all their criticisms from within this epistemological lens. And I do wonder, in fact, this values-laden dynamic, I think it should have been included. And I don't see a lot of it, as I've said before, in the paper. So the authors discuss foundational literature, Still and Sutherland, and then based only on their readings of those texts, they make certain propositions, and then they state that osteopaths should progress beyond those things. But so they're saying, you know, the old stuff says this, and osteopaths should move on. Then they're saying they should move on in this way and this way, as though they haven't moved on, or as though not all osteopaths have moved on. So I think they're certainly, in a lot of their work, as I've said before, are trying to say that most osteopaths are not moving on, and therefore they should. However, because they're only picking a few bits from the past and then saying nobody's moved on, they are actively ignoring all subsequent work, but then using subsequent works to criticize osteopaths, saying they aren't doing it. Anyway, but in looking at these early works and then saying, you know, you should move on, but they're not referencing works where these things, they're saying that osteopaths or the osteopathic profession aren't discussing these things. They're saying in the What's Wrong commentary that, you know, this sort of discourse must happen. This sort of analysis must happen. You know, you need to move on, and to move on, you need to have all these discussions and these reflections. But reflections are already going on. And to quote, you know, a very significant contemporary and, you know, important person from their own institution, such as Stephen Tyman, a very significant figure in the BSO/UCO, you know, quite sure they're more than sufficiently aware of his work, but they're not utilising it. Now, amongst other things, they discuss the dynamics of expert knowledge in osteopathy, yet make no mention of values. But all professions have values, and they're ignoring this completely in their construction of what the osteopathic epistemology is all about. And it seems very strange, because there's a really interesting paper from Tyman in particular about valuing osteopathy and what are our professional values and who do we teach them, and should we in fact not focus on principles and in fact focus on values to really understand the osteopathic contribution, etc. But the What's Wrong paper says, oh, let's just focus on only principles, where in fact there's a lot of debate about, in fact, is this the best lens anyway? But they've ignored that and chosen to do their own version for their own reasons and all of that type of thing. But having a values-led dynamic is in fact part of the current expert knowledge or expert style of practice, or the standards of practice that are required. They are in fact already built into what we should be doing, and in fact therefore are doing, unless they're trying to say that we're all incompetent and not fit to practice because we're not actually doing what our standards are calling us to do. I don't know, maybe they are saying that. But they're saying that, you know, all these standards are based on basically the standards have incorporated, you know, values and biopsychosocial care, all these patient-centeredness and so on. And all these regulatory bodies are orienting practice towards them. And that will have been based on a whole body of understanding that that's where osteopathic practice has got to. Those values, those capabilities, those osteopathic standards of practice have been quite carefully constructed based on what current practice is and what groups of osteopaths agree is what osteopathic practice is. And processes have been gone through to gather that understanding with which to then construct. So it's been constructed from capabilities and standards of practice have been constructed from within actual practice. So actual practice is already illustrating those things based on the fact that when you derive capabilities from practice and from practitioners, and then you ensure that, you know, that is based on broad concepts of what good practice is, when you put it all together, that is what osteopathy is already all about. But anyway, as I say, Stephen Tyman has produced many very interesting works, but certainly one where he's discussing about valuing osteopathy. It is, I think, interesting because, you know, Tyman quotes Sadler in that, who describes values, and you know, values are aesthetic values, epistemic values, ethical values, ontological values, pragmatic values. We need to speak about all these types of things, not just, you know, narrow technical rational examples of a certain type of epistemic knowledge, which the authors claim to be too limited. You know, the osteopathic profession has been debating for a long time how to include a wider range of values, practice knowledge, clinical discourse. We've been discussing for a long time how these things should be much more inclusive. So I don't know why they have chosen to narrow it back down again and say that's representative of current practice. I don't know why. Can't see why they've gone there, other than positing that there are perhaps political and power-based dynamics at play underneath all of this. That could be one reason. Who knows? Maybe it will become clear over time. So, okay, anyway, we still haven't got to what their 5 things, their 5 problems are. So they've made some propositions. So we're going to look at things through a positivism lens, which is, I think, where I feel they seem to be placing the osteopaths they're applying the critical theory to. Anyway, so there are propositions. So when we look at propositions, hypothetically, you know, in general, are the statements postulates, axiomatic or theoretical? You know, if you're going to sort of dig into it, there are lots of things you need to perhaps come to understand. Something that's an axiom is that you know, it seems so self-evident that you don't need to have any proof. And then theories are things, propositions and theories. If it's a theorem, then they should have been proven. Yeah. And then a postulate is something which is, you know, do we accept it as true without really bothering to go wondering whether there is a proof? So there are types of things. Some things seemingly we can agree that you don't need a proof. Some things we can get by without bothering to see if there actually is a proof. And then some things definitely will have had to have been proven for us to accept them. So propositions are murky things, and knowledge gained, and knowledge understanding these things. We use an understanding of all of these types of propositions and how we deal with them, how we get it, whether they need proof or don't need proof, or whether the proof is reasonable and so on. We get at them in certain ways, which we'll come to. But the whole idea is that you're trying to decide whether the knowledge is justified, whether it's true, or whether it's all in informed nonsense, whether there's lots of false positives, whether there's all sorts of lucky denials and, stuff. So you're trying to get rid of the rubbish and therefore have some security in what you know and what's been proven. So we try that, everyone would want to try to get a bit of clarity in this sort of murkiness. So the propositions. So osteopathy has a weak theoretical basis. Osteopathy contains an inherent biomedicalism. Osteopaths use mono-interventionism. Osteopaths deliver care that is practitioner-centered, or has a practitioner-centeredness. Osteopaths had a predilection for implausible mechanisms. So these are propositions. So we have to turn these problems into propositions so that we can then work out if they're true or reasonable or whatever. And we're going to do this through this sort of logical dynamic, a scientific sort of method. So we're using this sort of epistemological position to get at this, etc. So that's what we're going to try to go through in the rest of this whole talk. But there's just one more thing before we sort of get into that nitty-gritty, is that because the authors are using critical theory, that's their declared choice of analysis or lens, that critical theory is any approach to social philosophy that focuses on the society and culture and an attempt to reveal and critique and challenge power structures. So the power structure, for example, is the contemporaneous community of osteopaths and their adherence to certain beliefs and knowledge systems and approaches to practice. So that is a community which they feel has power, which they need to challenge, because the power is that, and the challenge is because that the way that osteopaths are practicing is having a negative impact on everything else. So they are viewing that there is a power in what they say. They're saying that that thing has a power because it's all rubbish and unfounded, and accordingly, because it nonetheless has a power in such things like, to the wider populace and other people get to know about all of that unfoundedness, it gives it a power, and therefore that should be challenged because it's unreasonable, and therefore critical theory seems a reasonable lens to take. So they are taking a deconstructive, challenging approach. It's a direct challenge to the way that many osteopaths legitimately and reasonably practice, and has, as evidenced by a notable social media backlash and call for debates with the authors by various regional societies in UK osteopathy, it's created people don't feel that challenge in that way is reasonable. And so that's what the debate about. Many osteopaths feel that their practice is legitimate, and they don't feel that the framing of their practice in the way that is espoused within the What's Wrong Osteopathy article is in fact legitimate, and that their legitimate practice is not defined in that way, and therefore calling on their practice to be challenged and dismissed is an unreasonable thing to do. So that seems to be the outcome of the critical theory application done in the way that it's done through this work, and as a result of them defining problems in the way that they have through the evidence that they have, and therefore framing those problems as problems which need to be challenged. So there's a whole stack of people which seem to say, hang about, that this is not practice as we know it. It's unreasonable to make those challenges. And so if one's then looking at why are you using a power challenge strategy, why are you doing it, or if you're doing it, have you considered, or what concern do you have, or do the authors have for the impact of their words, and are there any indications, where is the author's sensitivity to the members of the community that they are supposedly a part of, I wonder. And can you just resort to, this is merely rhetoric, it's up to you to respond, it's over to you to respond, type of thing. So they're challenging the structure of practice. So how valid are all these views? Is it reasonable that the power structures supported by these views, by such views that act on them, if they're not representative nor indeed legitimate? So, for example, the power structures enabled by the stance of such things as the what's wrong commentary seem to be emboldening a certain aspect of education, a certain nature of institutional approach to the education of osteopaths, certain agendas for dialoguing with healthcare systems seem to be being reinforced by saying we want practice to be this way, we don't want it to be that way. There are power agendas going on about how healthcare should be structured and what osteopaths' place in that health system should be. It should be structured in a certain way, and we're going to remove or challenge osteopathic practice that gets in the way of that agenda. So the power structures that like that agenda are essentially reinforcing their position through these sorts of commentaries to then enhance the ability of that deconstruction of that form of practice. But if you don't think any of that's really valuable or reasonable or valid, etc., so if you don't agree with all of that, and you feel that the power that needs challenging are all of those institutions, then it is quite reasonable that those power structures, those institutions, that agenda, that dialogue should be itself challenged. And critical theory, anyway, as I say, originally arose from the Frankfurt School in a post-Marxist dynamic, and it's to explore and interrogate the structures and discourses of power. So we are, I think, quite legitimate to, and it's necessary to interrogate those structures and discourses of power which are espoused and implied within such commentaries as the What's Wrong commentary. I think we're obliged to do it, certainly if we can see that some parts of the profession are disempowered by these sorts of dialogues and don't feel that they have the wherewithal to respond appropriately. I think it's beholden upon many other osteopaths and people within the profession to, on their behalf, attempt to emancipate their view so that it is heard. That's really important. So, one could argue that the resistance in the profession to what they're saying, how those people are railing against them is a valid response, and it should be continued. You can argue that, and I feel you should argue that. It's one thing to criticize, but surely if the idea is that the community of osteopaths changes their whole view, then anyway, surely there's a better path of argument than denigration through a critical theory lens. And surely if knowledge transfer is what they're aiming at, a better theoretical position could be sought. And it could be something such as institutional theory, recognizing that their institutional culture and environment has led them to a certain view, and that that frames their ongoing thought, and that if everybody understood that, then we could dialogue about the weakness of their institutional influence to get a better dialogue, and not just put the dialogue solely as having to reside within the osteopaths I think it has to reside within the institutions, and I think the reflection also needs to be there, and I don't see that it is sufficiently. I think that they need to not necessarily move the profession towards their own identity as encompassed by their institutionalization and where they want that institutional identity to move towards. I don't think that the rest of us should be made to struggle with their environmental stresses, and if they feel out of group stress because their desired inclusion in the community of health systems is challenged by what they see as the problematic position of osteopathy, that's their stress. And if we don't agree that their interpretation of osteopathy is reasonable, then why should our practice be exposed to their stress and their solutions? That's something that one could also consider in reading all of this. So yeah, are they merely players? And does that landscape or environment actually relate to the real world and lived experience of the whole of the osteopathic profession? Is what they're trying to suggest is wrong? Is it only as a result of their institutional bias and culture? So, is it reasonable then to call for a challenge based on the fact that it's their insecure, weakened environment that is leading them to have that view, and it is actually not reasonable and reflective of the whole osteopathic profession? They could perhaps look at actor network theory as a lens in which to explore all of that as well. But anyway, critical theories has been chosen. So they're using a critical theory. Why? Because could one consider that they're finding themselves trapped in a community in which they feel enslaved, and that rather than accept or consider that that community is actually legitimate, they seek to become emancipated from it by destroying it through critical challenge, regardless of the legitimacy of the challenge. Is that what they're doing? I don't know. That's a question I think we need to ask, though. And the whole dynamic of using critical theory is really interesting. There's a tension with pragmatism. There's all sorts of philosophical movements before, during, and after all of it. And I think that I don't know if it is the best lens. It's a lens, but maybe using that lens is actually holding back their ability to understand and interpret all of these, both historical and contemporaneous osteopathic practice. As I think there are other better lenses. So to proceed, or to continue to proceed, and to review the commentary as it's literally written, we're employing all these various strategies to try to get at these 5 positions, and as a result of all of this criticality, we're looking at the pool of the author's past works as part of that to see if we feel they're legitimate or reasonable commentators to help us understand whether they can be reasonably critical in their analysis. So before we can get to looking at their propositions, we have to look at we have to have strategies at looking at their works to see if those works and the way that they've used their citations and general, whether it all stacks up. So we look at anyway, in anything, in any review, not just this one, in any one, you should always look at the pool of the author's past works. So whoever's written what, you look at their past works, and then you can see if you look to see if those works are subject to any counterpoint or article or response. So what they said in the past, has anyone challenged it? And therefore, then when they discuss what they've said in the past, are they discussing that there in fact has been a challenge to it? Because that would be reasonable. So looking at how the authors have used their citations, are there points that they're making, are the points that they're making really supported by those citations? Are they using the citations accurately? So they've said, you know, blah, 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 point, reference X. So when you go to X, you should see that that citation does in fact support what they've just said. So you have to look to see whether it does. And then have they chosen the most current literature to include? You know, why would they not include the most current stuff? If the most current stuff, in fact, doesn't support their position, why have they gone back to earlier works that do? I don't know, you have to ask yourself these sorts of questions. So it's important to remember that their commentary was written from a position of criticality, so strong scrutiny is deployed accordingly. It should be deployed anyway. And then finally, you can think of the fact that this is a commentary. They're not normally peer-reviewed, usually. I don't know, maybe it was. There's some sort of statement about they didn't contribute to a peer review, but it's unclear what peer review this commentary was indeed subjected to. I don't know. They can clearly see. Normally peer review would do all this sort of thing. They'd track it all back. So when you're peer reviewing for a journal, you'd go back with all this scrutiny. And when you're doing your own reading at home, you would, you know, do this sort of interrogation as well to see how, you know, how much reasonableness you're going to put both from the author's historical positionality and the positionality that they take in the current work. So we do have to look at who is making the proposition. So we look at the propositions, the 5 propositions, but you also have to look at who is making them. Are they a reliable source? Are they a reliable witness? And how much should we trust what they say in the round? So that is something that we do have to do. So, you know, when we look back, have they got any bias in what they do? Is there any idea that they are constructing a narrative to suit their own views? Is the author's interpretation of evidence, has led to their positions? Is that interpretation reasonable, etc.? And if, when you dig through everything, if you find that many points in the article or any article are challengeable because of this constructed evidence trail or misrepresentation of evidence trails, or not using the best evidence that was available at the time when they wrote the work, if many of those points are challengeable and could arguably have led to a different commentary if only the full evidence was referred to, but those authors chose to represent only some of the evidence and misrepresented information from the sources that they do cite, then one has to ask, is that error or intention? And if it's the latter, if they intended that, is this because of some form of bias on the part of the authors? You'd need to ask those questions. And it's important to try to understand the wider landscape also of why such a commentary was indeed constructed in the way it was, when it was, etc. In general, anyway, a 2002 paper discusses how to avoid all of these types of dynamics and other similar types of dynamics in osteopathic research. So you need to look at all sorts of errors when you do work, and these errors and things to avoid, avoiding the propagation of the 4 M's. So you have to avoid doing mistakes, propagation of mistakes, misinterpretation, misrepresentation, and misinformation. You must do all those things. I'll run those. The authors of that paper are Draper, Rode, Voucher, Schmidt, Morin, and Thompson. So if they know that you should avoid those things, we would expect that in a work that they've done, whether it's a commentary or not, we would expect that in the work that they have done that there is none of these things, because they know to avoid them. But if you find them, what are you going to make of it all? So anyway, have responses to the past works have been challenged, and positions that they've taken in their commentary have been challenged in other works. And where they make statements about practice and progression within the practice, they appear to be omitting and misrepresenting active discussion that is in fact in the osteopathic literature, and they seem to be discussing a practice which is not represented because it's required in relevant statutory practice guidelines. So as we've already said, they're discussing a practice, and that practice isn't represented by what's actually done and isn't represented within the required practice anyway. So some of the citations that they rely on to make what seem to be generalizable statements as though they were reliable and proven are indeed unreliable in themselves. In other words, those citations I don't think are all fully suitable for the use they're being put to, and that the positions taken by the authors directly contradict the position taken in other works that they have separately authored. So in fact, they've said other things in other works, and they may have said a plurality of things in a number of works, but the positions in this paper are only some. So in this critical commentary that they are doing, they have chosen to admit more recent work that contradicts their positions, even though they are aware of those works because they have cited them elsewhere or in other articles and in other commentaries. What are we to make of that? I don't know. You'd have to ask yourself that question. Now again, I'm just picking briefly a couple of things. There has been a challenge to past commentaries they've made. So are they being as rigorous in their own work as they implore others to be in theirs? So one example would be Marin versus Draper-Rodi. And in fact, so there's some papers down here, and this is about the COVID stuff and osteopathy and the reasonableness. And so Marin et al. Wrote a paper, Draper-Rodi et al., which was co-authored by Thompson, made a response. And in the response, they said that there was bias and misrepresentation by Marin et al., etc. And then, Marin et al. Actually gave quite a well-reasoned response to the response, saying, in fact, actually, you're saying that we claimed certain things, and in fact, we weren't actually doing that. So they were pointing out fairly reasonably that that initial response was partly flawed as a response. So that there's been a counter narrative saying, hang on, guys, you're not necessarily being as reasonable as you want everyone else to be. You're not being as reasonable in your own work as you're saying. Then in fact, you've got these things about when two or possibly more papers authored by the same person directly contradict each other. For example, this one stance in the What's Wrong with Osteopathy commentary is that osteopathy is biomechanical, biomedical, and not patient-centered. Whereas in another paper authored with a principal author is Thompson as well, is that the first lines of the abstract in that is that the patient-centeredness in their practice, in other words, biopsychosocial practice is done. It's a defining nature of osteopathy. So, Thompson et al. Might say that osteopaths are really rubbish at doing it, but that's not the same thing as saying that attempting to have biopsychosocial thing is not actually part of osteopathy. Many people feel that it is a defining feature of osteopathy. So you can't recognize that many authors say it is a defining feature of osteopathy and at the same time say it is not patient-centered. So this stance illustrates that there is a patient-centeredness, and you can't then say separately, which one do you consider? And if you are already understanding that perhaps some aspects of practice are patient-centered, you cannot then just say it is only practitioner-centered. Anyway. So there's lots of things that we could do with all of that. But their authors are making various arguments, they're taking various positions. They do seem to be constructing them in part from out-of-date references. They're perhaps taking quotes out of context. They are doing incomplete reporting and selective reporting, all of which forms of bias, and they're ignoring more recent debates and positions within the profession and etc. And in addition, they also quote themselves a lot within all of these different papers on several occasions. And on the issue of self-citation, this is not deemed to be the best practice. You may need to do it, but caution must be applied when you see lots of papers referred to that cite the same authors repeatedly and between papers, each citing each other. And I don't know what that then says about trustworthiness. So there may be many bits of bias, I think, going on in these works and in this work and in the what's wrong work. And that doesn't mean to say that trustworthiness is ruled out by biases, but I think that we just have to sit and think about, do we think it's biased? Do we think it's therefore trustworthy? What do we make of this? So if I want to dig deep into how they are justifying their propositions, this is all relevant to how we're going to read what they're saying. So let's dig on back to deconstructing the work. Digging on seems a useful pun at this point. But anyway, they've got these propositions. We're going to interrogate these propositions, and we do so by using types of logic constructions in understanding the author position. So what we're trying to do is I think we need to use logic because I think that's a method that is embedded within the epistemology they're trying to come at the work from. So I think we've got to look at logic constructions, etc. So, for example, in the inherent biomedicalism problem or section, they go on about ideal form, and they go on about physical form and focusing, and they're saying various things. So ideal form, so all non-ideal forms are rejected. So at one point they're saying that osteopaths consider that we should all have an ideal form, and that the early texts are saying they idealize the ideal form, and that no one can be ideal. And if you are in a practice which embraces the concept of ideation, you are therefore, by absolute default, disabling people. You're rejecting all forms of the non-ideal. Anyone that is not matching that, you are then rejecting them, thus you're disabling them and denigrating them, denigrating their reality, disavowing them, and so forth. They're also saying that with a physical form or a focus on physical form and a structure function focus, this means the osteopath has to fix the person. So again, disempowering the individual and disabling them. And that they are saying that modern osteopathy, because it hasn't moved on from more early osteopathy, is wedded to the ideal abstract form and is therefore discriminating and ableist. And again, that there's a lot of this above defense of the above truths seems to also come from other works, such as the Macmillan work on ableism and osteopathy, but we'll return later to that. So you've got to sort of work out, what's the logic, what's the proposition, what's going on. And so in the first instance anyway, they're saying that osteopathy is looking at idealism, but would everyone agree that their interpretation of ideal, is that correct? Is their claim that what osteopaths are aiming at, is it that osteopaths are aiming at their version of what they think the ideal means? I don't know that everyone would agree that their interpretation of ideal is right, but anyway, you'd have to ask if everyone agrees on their understanding of what ideal means, and does everyone agree with their claim that that's what osteopaths are aiming at? So if yes, fair enough. If no, their logic stream is challengeable. So if they've got some form of logic they're trying to say is that, osteopathy is interested in an ideal form. If all non-ideal forms are to be rejected because they're disabling, thereby all osteopaths that utilize original osteopathy and idealism are disabling people. So that's like a type of logic stream. So if you don't agree with the first part, that their interpretation of ideal is right, then perhaps their logic stream is challengeable. If there's a different interpretation of ideal, and adjustment to the ideal could be read as making the best of for that person within their context internally and in their environment, within their sense of personal meaning. If adjustment means that, as opposed to adjustment meaning the osteopath is just going to crack it because it's not a straight upright posture. If there's a different interpretation to the adjustment that osteopaths do based on having an idea of ideal, then again, there's a challenge to the logic in there somewhere. So to understand if we agree with the truth of the knowledge that they're sharing or whatever, it's important to look at their knowledge and reasoning, as I said, and that normally when one is looking, there are general principles about deductive and inductive logic. So if you're going to get to grips with or how you can learn to challenge things, ultimately you're going to have to look at logic, and you're going to have to understand both formal and informal, and you're going to have to look at deductively deductive dynamics and how to make valid inferences or logical truths and all of that. So again, we're not going to be able to get you to literally understand all of that if you don't understand it already, but you do have to know that there are types of reasoning, and if the What's Wrong article or any other commentary or research piece is trying to use a form of reasoning, then you have to see if that reasoning is reasonable. So inductive and deductive reasoning are two types of logical thinking. So inductive reasoning starts from having a specific observation and forms a general theory. Deductive reasoning starts from a general theory and tests it with specific cases. So inductive reasoning can generate new knowledge, but it can also lead to false conclusions. So inductive reasoning hopefully gets you to understand things, but it's prone to getting you to a nonsense position. Now, deductive reasoning can prove certain things and can produce valid conclusions, but only if the premises were true. So you've got to then think of whether the premises on which it's based are true or not, in which case if they're not true, you can't use deductive reasoning, or any conclusions drawn by deductive reasoning cannot be valid if the original premises are not true. And inductive reasoning, yes, it can generate new knowledge, but it can be very unreliable, and it can lead to if there are faults in your inductive reasoning, then there can be problems. Anyway, we mentioned Popper above, and you can't, if you're using inductive evidence and logic, it is pretty limited, because you can't actually observe the universe all the time and in all places, and we're not therefore justified in making a general rule from observation of particulars. So if we saw this in this instance, then that. So if we saw from 12 osteopaths this and this, therefore we're going to know X. We can't say that, because we can't know all instances of all osteopathic practice. So using that inductive logic falls apart, etc. So we need to look at all of these sort of logic dynamics. So I'm just trying to pick up some bits and pieces. I'm not going to go into whether they're inductive or deductive, but we can certainly see that somewhere along the lines that there is a problem with passing from one to the other. So references to ideal means something abstract and not personalized. So ideal means an ideal out there. It's an abstractive form. And if you're not that abstracted form over there, something that is not personalized is ableist. So if you're saying that it's something abstract over there, it cannot be personalized. Anything which is not personalized is ableist. So therefore, all osteopaths that reference ideal are ableist. Okay, so that's one thing that we can, which I think they're saying, which we can then pick apart. What's another thing? So osteopaths find and discuss things in the body. Discussing the body is abstracting it and disempowering it. The person's body image and their self-agency and all of that is ableist. So if you discuss the body, it's ableist. So that all osteopaths that talk to patients about their body are ableist. And in fact, anyway, if we look at Macmillan's work, we can see that that's not been found. But anyway, that does seem to be something which is emerging about what they're trying to put across in this What's Wrong paper. Osteopaths concentrate on doing something to a patient's body. Any practitioner that does something, any act of doing is viewing the patient as passive, so that the practitioner is focusing on their role, the doing, and not the patient's role. So anyone that does is practitioner-centered, basically. So all osteopaths are practitioners that do, and therefore are all practitioner-focused. So if you want to say that osteopaths concentrate on doing something to the body, that seems to be reasonable. Then you look at this, you say, any practitioner that does anything, any act of doing, is disempowering and therefore not patient-centered, because you're doing it onto them. So that's not patient-centered, that's practitioner-centered, because it's a doing act. So there would then seem to be no way getting around the fact that all osteopaths, as practitioners that do, are therefore practitioner-focused by default. And if you think practitioner-focused means biomedicalism and is a problem, you have therefore just proven the fact that because osteopaths do something on the body, that they are definitively biomedical, and that there is an inherent biomedicalism in osteopathy. And so then if you find evidence that they, in the other works, or that other people in other works that they're aware of, if one finds that there is evidence that osteopaths in their doing also demonstrably practice patient-centeredness, you cannot say that the osteopathic doing encompasses only practitioner focusing, and therefore not all osteopaths that do are disabling, for example. So you have to try to find problems within these logic things or reasoning things or propositional examples. So are there problems? Yes, there are, and there are many such things. So it's in this way that we try to go through all of the 5 identified problems and all the bits encompassed within those 5 problems, because each of those 5 problems means many different things, and there are many different bits that you could pick out. And so, we've got to see if there are factors that change the original premises or falsify their logic, and if we are, then those 5 identified problems have not been properly identified, and therefore you can challenge whether you can call them problems, and all that then ensues. So the 5 works again. Let's go through finally. Let's go through finally all these truths as they seem to see them. So weak theoretical basis, inherent biomedicalism, mono-interventionism, practitioner-centeredness, predilection for implausible mechanisms. So let's have a look. Weak theoretical basis. So they seem to be drawing or making this conclusion on their reading of foundational texts, but only on their reading of only those foundational texts which they have chosen to include. So not all foundational texts, but only some that they've chosen for whatever reason. So they have picked out that there is a study of anatomy rendering, and that is the mere fact of studying anatomy renders the profession biomedical, and therefore as such is unfit for modern healthcare practices. So this, their construction seems to equate the interest in anatomy as evidence that osteopaths are using a posture biomechanical structural approach that they additionally criticise as implausible. and it excludes therefore the inclusion of many health practitioner roles and stances, such as patient engagement, shared dialogue, patient agency, and self-care, for example. So all of that, I think it is refutable. So they seem to claim that shared therapeutic alliance and co-created dialogue is not part of osteopathy, but it should be. They also are referring in this section on weak theoretical basis. They refer to critical theory and the dynamics of power and organizational structures and systems. But as I say, I think there's a strong argument that can be made that this is a poor academic piece of work, and through a poor work, they're contributing to a misdirecting of power dynamics and creating and manifesting challenges to a professional identity and the professional cohesion. I think they're deliberately attempting to influence the social dynamics within the community of osteopaths and osteopathic practice to push an agenda towards descriptors of osteopathy that they feel comfortable with, regardless of this discomfort of others in the community they engage with. So the descriptor that they feel comfortable with is that osteopaths, through their study of anatomy, are biomechanical and biomedical, and that as such do not engage in patient engagement, shared dialogue, and enhancing of patient agency. That is their construction of osteopathy. So they determine that, saying then therefore that is a weak theoretical basis. Anyway, so they're saying that traditional osteopathy is said to be technical only. Now, I really don't think you can say that, but they say it is. So they say that it's technical only, and it's looking at ideal posture, and it's taking a structural biomechanical perspective, and it lacks thought. And it should be about looking at a process. Sorry, that's a process driven. That's my wrong in the moment typo. So traditional osteopathy is not about looking at the processes that are going on in osteopathy. If you want to critique traditional osteopathy, you should move to a more process-driven model, which should be about helping to restore health and function, helping to promote healing, and not just imposing the operator-derived ideas, regardless of the state of the patient. So the structural model, which essentially is embedded in this traditional osteopathy, the structural, it relates into the technical only, looking only at ideal and just doing what you think rather than what's reasonable to do to help the patient enhance their own healing. They're saying that all of this is what traditional osteopathy is and should therefore be moved on from. I'm not sure that actually, if you read the early works, that their construction of osteopathy and traditional osteopathy being technical only and looking at ideal posture in such a way, being operator derived and driven, I don't think that is what is. I don't think that that's the only way, or in fact a reasonable way of reading these early works. And in fact, I do think that there's a processness in the way that the early works are trying to get you to enhance from within, get the patient to. I think the early works are saying expressly that you should consider how to restore health and function and healing. And the fact that one requires help maybe, or could benefit from help from, say, someone, does not detract from there being does not detract from the whole story. So if you're saying that biomedicalism means that you're imposing something on the patient and that no one should be doing anything to the patient, then if the person, for example, if the person can't think themselves out of it, they can't sort of dialogue and cognitively understand their way out of wherever they're at, and they can't socially relocate themselves, and if doing those things don't remove the somatic contributions of their dysregulation, why is it that it is unreasonable to have a therapeutic intervention that's considered the somatic body dynamic parts? And why is it problematic that it is applied by someone who is experiencing or who has experience in that practice domain. Just because you want to enhance someone's health and that you are using a lens of active engagement with the patient's body to do it, doesn't mean that you aren't focusing on the processes of restoration of health and function with and for that person. Patients want to know what's wrong and what they can do, and osteopaths can offer them a somatic conversation. So why can the osteopath part, if it is enabling and performing a somatic conversation, why can that not in fact be a predominant and important part? Why cannot that be, or should not that be, the most important part that is the osteopathic role? Why can the osteopathic role not be to predominantly offer that somatic conversation? But it seems to be that we're failing to take note of osteopath's experiences, and it should be about the patient for them. And so it should all be about how we can work with them in other ways than osteopathy. In other words, we need to leave the hands-on behind to become proficient in other types of care. And I don't think that they've answered why, if there is value and patients recognise value, and if there's a contribution that hands-on care can provide, why cannot that be predominant in the osteopathic role? I don't think they've argued reasonably why it should not be. So if osteopathy, though, is what osteopaths do, and if some osteopaths do something else, then obviously the definition of osteopathy changes. So if through regulation, and if we wanted regulation, we agreed to use evidence, it's essentially too bad if that evidence is for something that doesn't actually explore the concepts of care that you felt were important. So if you felt that the hands-on dynamic was important to research, but people didn't value that and only valued other forms of evidence, then they would refuse. So therefore, if there is at the moment the evidence that is there is not exploring that hands-on component, so there is no evidence because no one's exploring it. If you refuse to teach a thing where there is no evidence, means that there never is going to be any research on that, and so therefore that practice is always going to be non-evidenced. It's a self-confirming prophecy. And is it true that patients don't care if we have hands-on, that they only want what helps them? So if they're coming to us expressly for our expertise in the hands-on, this is their express rationale for attending. Experientially, this is something real in osteopathic practice, and it's not simply a case of osteopathic hypnosis and false advertising, duping patients and paternalizing them and disabling them and disempowering them. Should one consider that the patients have a truth in that they have made a reasonable decision because they value the osteopathic hands-on dynamic, and so if the osteopathic skills are providing something that is valuable to that set of patients, if you then don't teach those skills, you're then denying what some patients are actually seeking. So that could be a problem. So if osteopaths are doing something valuable, why do you need to change all of what osteopathy does to make osteopathy do what others' professions provide as a thing of value? So, there are lots of different ways of experiencing anatomy. And I think that, lots of people are subsequently recognizing that touch can be a very multi-layered thing, and that you can use touch which isn't based on anatomy that means you have to push, crunch, pull and twist. And there's lots of things, lots of works about touch that can be interesting to include, but they're seeming to say that we predominantly only use this biomechanical tissue-based knowledge. Oh, it's the knee ligament, that's the pain, I'm going to twist the ligament, which your knee is not in an ideal alignment anyway, so therefore that's the problem. And I don't think that it's reasonable to say that even osteopaths within the traditional model do only that. I think that many osteopaths within a traditional model have a very wide range of perspectives about why they're touching, and have derived their way of touching from those original traditional principles. The varying reasons for touch are not confined to the biomedical engine that the authors imply, and that these varying versions of interaction with tissues and touch and people, they were present before and not derived from later course from other professions' evidence about, actually, you could use touch in this way as well. I think actually osteopaths were already using touch in lots of ways before all this other later discourse came along, and that essentially that later evidence is showing something, it's revealing something which was already found in historical and traditional as well as contemporaneous osteopathic practice. So I think the dynamic that they're trying to say, that this focus on osteopathy, on anatomy and osteopathy is this thing, I just don't think it's quite right somehow. I think they've gone wrong somewhere there. So anatomy, this is portrayed as the foundation of osteopathy, and it is the most significant aspect of its biomedicalism, supposedly. So they're exploring this, for example, through two sources: philosophy and practice and autobiography. There's no use of research and practice, for example. I don't know why, but anyway. So let's see. From the two sources that they use philosophy and they use autobiography, etc. So from philosophy, they pick out this phrase, begin and end with anatomy. Surely, therefore, because there is a beginning and an ending with anatomy, surely this is proving the biomedicalism and reductionism in osteopathy, they say. Yes, they say, of course it does. So they're picking out a phrase. No, they've picked out part of a phrase, but if you read on, you have to understand what still means by anatomy, not what the authors or others say still, or osteopaths mean by anatomy. So they are saying that there is a version of anatomy which they are then claiming can be biomedical and reductionist, but still has clearly said that osteopathy, that anatomy isn't actually that, because he's gone on to define anatomy. And so we can read on, and then presumably they did read on. And if they did read on, why didn't the authors choose to reflect the text as a whole? In that, the anatomy is described as something not which they describe it as. In that text, still says he will explain what he means by anatomy. You are conducted to the branch of anatomy called physiology, a knowledge of which no osteopath can be about. So it's a complete representation to say that the seminal texts confine osteopathic thought merely to the bodily form, i.e. structural anatomy. Even at the very least, anatomy is physiological dynamics. And if you then go on anyway to read his other books and research and practice, you can see that that conjunction of anatomy and physiology, again, cannot be reduced to a biomedical construct of saying, oh, well, if it's not just anatomy, anatomy and physiology are both biomedical dynamics. The point is that the osteopathic texts are trying to get you to understand that it is how the appreciation of the interaction within anatomy and physiology in that person at that time in the moment is having an impact which you can perceive through your hands-on experiencing, and that you can work with the person's tissues, body, physiology, self-regulating mechanisms in the moment to lead to a different sort of dynamic. So because they're misreading the paper, They're saying anatomy is something that very paper is not saying it is. So they've taken a view which is not the represented view in the work they're quoting. And they're then saying that because the view that they've taken, that it is a structural anatomy, it's a focus only on the bodily form, the ideal bodily form, that therefore it's essentially all that logic comes us down to ableism. All those things then on ableism, which rely on that physicality construct, must be read with caution at the very best. And anyway, the University College Osteopathy was once the British School of Osteopathy, and there was a founder, obviously, of the British School of Osteopathy who was extremely interested in physiology, not just anatomy. So the founder of the BSO was Little John, but no reference was including regarding the founder of the practice of osteopathy in the UK, the same institution for which both authors work or have worked. So they have not treated Little John, who was the founder of the BSO, as student of Stills. They are not treating Little John as worthy as and Little John's works as being worthy of consideration as being a foundational text. Yet they quote Sutherland, who came after Little John. So they skip Little John, don't know why, seems strange. So they refer to two seminal works and they ignore a guy in the middle. On what basis then are they deciding that these are foundational works only and that this is not a foundational work, for example? So, they're ignoring the works of a very prominent founder member. Surely Little John's words are foundational. I don't know. There's not a spirit of mention. And Little John's discussions, though, when you do go into his work, they are Little John's discussions of physiology are in the context of Little John's mechanics, which were an analysis of the relationship of posture and physiological integration. It was never just a mechanistic spine-centric model. So it isn't just about crack left, crack right. You have to untwist it, derotate it, and then ergo, all liver cancer is cured. That's not literally what classical osteopathy is. Classical osteopathy isn't represented by such a model. So it's a misrepresentation, perhaps, to say that postural models that use adjustment are problematic in the same way that they say they are. So some models in osteopathy, some early models, aren't actually focusing on ideal. They're focusing on adjustment towards. They're focusing on adjustment towards a better integrated oscillatory, efficient physiological organism for that person at that time in the way. It is expressly how to recognize the individualism in that person and in the context of their patients, body, person, and whole dynamic. The adjustment is towards that individual's dynamic. And I don't see that as being ableist, because if they were ignoring what was within the person, then yes. But if you adjust towards how they are within themselves, then that cannot be ableist. I don't know. So I just don't think that adjustment, it does not mean spinal manipulation and de-twisting as in an operator-derived and driven model, which I think is what they're trying to somehow imply that it is. Again, we can sort of quote a lot of things that also say that osteopathy isn't just anatomy, and that osteopathy is cannot be said to not be a shared dialogue with the patient. So they say that osteopathy is only anatomy and that there is no shared dialogue with the patient in osteopathy because it's based on anatomy, and that doesn't do that. But actually you can refute that, because if you look around, You can look a lot about spiritualism and vitalism as evidence in osteopathic practice, both historically and currently, and that there are many inferences about and many foundational discussions about the fact that there is a lot of spiritual practice in osteopathy, and that osteopathy is rooted in a spiritual perspective, and that you can practice in a spiritualistic manner, which leads to a whole host of different ways of enabling the person. And a spiritual perspective is definitively not embedded in a reductionist, anatomistic, operator-driven crack crunch model. So if they're saying that's what osteopathy is, they're denying all of the evidences around the fact that osteopathy is inclusive of and based upon healing practices that include a spiritual perspective. So why are they not alluding to any of that? Spirituality includes the process of discovering meaning and purpose and self-understanding in the midst of one's life story. And that the role of a spiritual caregiver is to journey with people on their story journeys, discerning with them possibilities for hope and helping them gain a fuller sense of selfhood. And that actually there's a load of evidence phenomenologically exploring the fact that there's a practitioner perceptions of the role of spirituality in osteopathic practice to enable all of this journeying with them, which and there's not one mention of this reductionist biomedical and anatomistic cracking in that illustration of osteopathic practice. Lots of people are discussing, the mind-body dynamic in osteopathy, and is there a spiritual dimension in osteopathic care? And they seem to have ignored the fact that both then and now and currently this is an ongoing dialogue. Why are they ignoring this and then trying to essentially say to just ignore all of that and to say that the osteopathy is only how they've read bits of the early texts, whereas if others have read the whole versions of those early texts, they've seen that it says all sorts of other things as well and have gone on down that path. And the osteopathy derived from that is very different from that which is supposedly confined by the Thompson and Macmillan interpretation. So I think there's lots of issues there. There's a whole dialogue about spirituality and osteopathy being a service, and that a service is something for others. It's not for oneself. If you view osteopathy as the purpose of your osteopathy is to serve others, then it brings a whole other different context to osteopathy. And actually there is a continued dialogue in osteopathy, both then and now and ongoingly, about spirituality and service. And none of this is mentioned by them. And I don't understand why, because it's in the same texts that they're reading, and it's additionally reinforced in early texts that they've chosen not to refer to, and it's embedded throughout ongoing literature, which they deem is not relevant because they only say that they should read early ones, and only the early ones they choose. What about something else that's seemingly overlooked in Still's writing, this issues of vital influences and vitalism, vitalistic force, and so on? There's lots of that. So why have they only picked out the anatomy words? I think it could easily be argued that there is a huge vitalistic conversation spreaded throughout the early works, from Still, from Littlejohn, from others. And if we look at, all of the dynamics of vitalism, we get a completely different perspective of health and etc. that is not biomedical. And so if are you dismissing all the vitalistic aspects? Why? Is it irrelevant? Okay, vitalism is a complex subject, and lots of professions find it complicated, but You're denying that it's there because you've excluded it by only emphasizing one aspect, where clearly many other aspects and threads were embedded in those original works. And so there's a whole really interesting discussion, if you want to look at vitalism and metaphors and have a look at this whole philosophical debate, and plus some comments on osteopathy, and in fact using the referring to the man as machine metaphor, which the authors are claiming positions osteopathy and biomedicalism. But perhaps they're misunderstanding the metaphor, and you could read other texts which helps you understand whether they are in fact misconstruing things, which I think perhaps they are. But anyway, you can have a little bit of a look at that. There's another thing that's not mentioned, another demonstration of a type of vitalism, which is talk about 80 stills biogen. But, somehow, this doesn't get into the mix either. So lots of these other texts are actually describing osteopathic practice as phenomenological practices. So it's really interesting because in part of their discussion on how osteopathy should move on from its weak theoretical position, biomedicalism and exclusion of models of healthcare that relate to the meaning making of the patient and biopsychosocial dynamics, they identify phenomenology as a model osteopaths could and should move towards. But they're ignoring the fact that there's a lot of phenomenologically based evidence in osteopathy about saying that osteopathy is a phenomenological practice. But they're saying, oh, by the way, why don't you try phenomenology as a lens? But the osteopathic profession already is, so I don't get why they're trying to imply that it isn't. So anyway, I've already listed a few. There's a few more. There's lots. And then back to Biogen, and Littlejohn has an extensive use of the term vital forces. So many people are discussing things other than the anatomy and the reductionist spine-oriented crack crunch models. So I think that they've missed whole swathes of stuff, and so therefore their constructs can't be reasonable because they are excluding for no reasonable reason that I can see or that they've put forward as to why they've excluded all of these things. So there are lots of ways of knowing. There are lots of ways of knowing that we can't yet get to. There are, as we said in our chart before, there's a scientific method is one, but there's an intuitive one, there's an experiential one, there's a, etc. There are many different sorts of knowings, and there are lots of things going on which we don't yet know how to know. But you can't then say that because you don't know how to know them, that they are there or not there and not relevant. We have to persist, or one could argue that it's reasonable to want to persist in exploring how to know those things which we don't yet know, because we haven't got the knowing methods to know them. So you can't say they're not true, they're not valid, they're not this, that, or the other, because you can't know them, so you can't determine any of those things. And to try to, bring a sort of roundness back into it, there does seem to be, I think, a strong continuum in osteopathy from early writings to the current modern practice about giving the body back to themselves, giving the person back their vitality so that the person can heal themselves, contributing to that dialogue in the patient. And that Littlejohn taught that health rests on a three-pillared foundation, namely adjustment of the structure, adjustment of the function, but adjustment of the organism to its environment. And adjustment of the organism to its environment is inclusionary, and it requires interaction with the person, not simply their body, and it realises what in their environment they can or cannot adjust to. So I think that there really is a need to reread these classical osteopathic texts, and that seeing is an essential skill, and seeing with our hands, phenomenologically knowing through the thinking, seeing, feeling, hand delivered phenomena. That is a valid knowledge in osteopathy, and that is our way of engaging our interaction back from our phenomena, from our experience and reflections on that phenomena, back through then into the corporeal reality of that patient. We are then, as we reflect that back and go with that flow with them, we are then contributing to how that person then is enhancing themselves. I don't see any of that understanding coming through in the readings that they've done as portrayed in what they've said and quoted in the What's Wrong article. And additionally, something as, they say somewhere as well that, osteopaths have a calling and there's a religiosity, and this is all really bad. And, as part of the weak theoretical basis, we shouldn't rely on the fact that we have a calling to be an osteopath. And this is a bad thing. But somehow having a calling is peculiar to osteopathy. And it's not at all peculiar to osteopathy. I think so many healing, caring, helping professions, including medicine and everybody, they are all known to have an element of calling within them. Calling is recognised. It's not uniquely osteopathic, and it's not problematic. There's lots of literature discussing medical doctors and their callings into medicine, and their healthcare. That they're not lacking in contemporaneous practice and evidence awareness in this regard, are they? What? Because they have a calling they can't do patient-centered care, for example. This is all a bit illogical. So they're saying that osteopaths have a calling is problematic, and it means that we are inherently biomedical reductionist and not patient-centered. But having a calling does not mean any of those things. And I don't think they've pointed to evidence which says that it does. Anyway, let's move on. So weak theoretical basis, all of that came under their dynamics of weak theoretical basis, and there is a lot of blurring of the lines. So they've picked out 5, but they then splurge, I think, the same sort of arguments threaded through each of them. So I'm not sure that there are as many as 5. I think they're probably 1, but anyway. So they're saying biomedicalism. They haven't defined their version of biomedicalism. But as I said, they are then going through a lot of this understanding of the ideal form in osteopathy. So if you're interested in anatomy, you're interested in this ideal form. I've already alluded to some of the problems with this train of thought earlier in this discussion. But let's just look at osteopathic ableism. So if we look at a critical disability view of traditional osteopathic theory and modern practice, so this study illustrates that having a focus on anatomy ignores the patient and creates a view of them as disabled and needing an osteopath's help. So thereby it is an exclusionary narrative that views impairment as a disability, a departure from the ideal requiring help from the osteopath. So there's been a study done which concludes this, which the authors in the What's Wrong work quotes or cites. And in that, they are citing commentaries as though they were the way that they've used citations in the ableism article, again, I think doesn't allow them to construct what they have necessarily constructed. And that if you look at the data that they quote in the study that they did in that article, then I don't think that they are accurately fully portraying all of their then revealed understanding of what osteopathic practice is, so that there is some revelation in their data that they quote, which shows that they have found out that osteopaths that use touch do it in a way that it is not exclusionary and disabling, and which the patients themselves are revealing as having empowered them and enabled them, and so on. But they're only seemingly quoting or concluding about those examples, which aren't all the examples. They've picked some examples to then say that the overall finding is that osteopathy is ableist. So I'm very interested in why they've chosen that. Now, there's lots of actually really interesting things about osteopathy aiding body image, aiding self-agency, and this is another really interesting thing about osteopathy. Osteopathic body healing reflected in children's drawings, and if you do some osteopathic dynamics, then the person is able to express their embodiedness differently through a changed drawing that they've then done about how those patients view themselves, and that's what osteopathy has achieved. So that is, I think, a very enabling example, and it's far from being then this postural biomechanical model using the identified version of idealistic knowledge or logic, and therefore being ableist. I think there are lots of examples. There are further comments to be made on this inherent biomedicalism. So they, for example, quote, on noticing the litany of posturo-structural biomechanical focused literature, CPD, and discourse. They put in there, and they're referring to an article talking a different language. Now so they're saying that in osteopathy, there's a huge litany, an ongoing reproduction of this posturo-structural mechanical focused literature, all through osteopathy, in all the osteopathic CPD, all the discourses. And so they're saying it's just going on and on and on, this repetition of this structuro-biomechanical focused literature. And because it's going on and on and on, obviously osteopathy is continuing to be ableist, and because a structural mechanical focused interest means that you are ableist, as they've tried to say before. So they're saying it's going on and on and on, and they're using one reference. So hopefully it's going to be a good one. So they use one reference which is about discourse, nothing about, all this literature, posturo-structural biomechanical focused literature. They don't give a reference for that. They don't give a reference for the CPD, which is supposedly focused on posturo-structural biomechanical focused stuff. Now, this stuff may all be there, but they haven't referenced it. They've chosen to use one. So let's look at that one, because it should be good. So Thompson's an author. He's quoting his own work, or at least where he is the primary author of the paper reporting the work. So as we've already said, this isn't the only place where this author or the other author quotes their own or each other's works. But anyway, so this study, this talking study, talking a different language study, there's a few things that we can notice. Now, it says it has purposive sampling, apparently. So, and then it says that there are 6 males and only 3 females. But essentially, they said that they wanted the sample to be representative and that it was representative. So if you look at what they say in this talking a different language thing, they do state that it was a representative sample. They aimed at representation. But the way that but anyway, what they ended up with is not representative, because that's not the ratio of males and females in general practice. So it isn't representative, even though they were aiming at representative. And they said that we don't even, so what they if they wanted it to be representative, purposive sampling should have been done in such a way that they would then cross-refer to whether that purposive sampling is representative. So if representation was what they were aiming at, purposive sampling is okay. You'd need to know that what is it being representative of the general population seen by osteopaths, or is it representative of the patients seen within the BSO clinic, or what? So I don't know what it was supposed to be representative of sufficiently, but the way they went about it was not actually purposive, it was convenience sampling. And this is actually a major error of reporting. It's convenience sampling because what they did was that they advertised around the clinic in order to try to just gather whom they could. Now that is not purposive, that's convenience. They're sticking something up there and they're hoping that they're going to get a bunch of people. And if they get a bunch of people, they'll just have to stick with what they've got. So that's convenience sampling. Now they also said in this write-up of this study that the study had been reported according to correct. And I'm not sure that the correct, so that's the correct thing is fully filled in correctly. Anyway, purposive versus convenience sampling. The paper gathered possible participants by an advert in the clinic. Now, the student researcher was a student clinician, so this is convenience sampling. If there was purposive sampling, there should have been a statement made about what was the purpose of that purposive sampling. Has to have a purpose, so it is purposeful, and you make a statement. So in correct, you need to make that statement or declare it so that you can see if it was representative or not. So you can't then generalize from an unrepresentative sample which was gathered through an incorrectly quoted methodology. Yeah, so I think there's a few problems with the way that study was reported in the very least. There may be all sorts of things inherent with the way the original study was done, but we're only commenting on at the moment what was written up, what was the write-up of this study. And I think there are ways in which that write-up was done, which makes it then problematic. So they're using, though, this reference about talking. They're using this talking reference to say that there is evidence of a complete over-focusing on and a litany of postero-structuro biomechanical focused discourse. So this paper is supposed to prove that basically everyone's banging on about this postero-structuro biomedical reductionist type stuff. So it's used to support the words that there is a continued litany of blah, 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 and it fails. Because in the paper doesn't state that the study's conclusions are that a litany of postero-structuro mechanical focused discourse has been revealed. And anyway, as it's not representative of anything other than the convenience sample interviewed, it cannot be used in support of such a statement, which is clearly designed in the way it's then later used to be a statement of fact applicable to the wider osteopathic profession. And I think that's misrepresentation. So the study doesn't conclude this, that there is this litany. So as I say, again, another sort of bit of an issue on this paper is the reference to COREC. And if you use the COREC sheet and go through it yourself and look at what was reported, I actually don't think it's as complete as they said, and that they said their reporting was aligned to this. I don't think it was. That's a bit troubling. Normally in COREC there'd be a coding tree. So there was these people, the patients were gathered, the patients were interviewed, what was interviewed was transcribed, and then it was coded. And normally, when you report all of these sorts of things, you report your coding tree. And this wasn't done. I don't know whether one was ultimately ever constructed originally, but it certainly wasn't done. So if you're following correc, it says, was there or wasn't there a coding tree included? So they should have been prompted to include one, and presumably it's possible to construct a coding tree from the way it was done, but it wasn't put in the paper, and why not? So we don't know if all of the themes were actually reported, or whether there was just a certain choosing of which themes to report. So when the paper is discussing themes, it's discussing some themes, but a coding tree would show you all the themes that were supposedly found. So we don't know if they're representing fully what was in the study, or whether they've only chosen to discuss certain parts. And you know, also one wonders whether the way that it was then done in practice is that when you do theming and coding, you'd have a second researcher do stuff. You'd look at the reasonableness of what was done. Could somebody else have reasonably come up with those codes based on that data, etc., and so on. And that apart from not being sure whether the data clearly represents the findings, and I'm not sure if minor themes were identified and discussed appropriately, I'm also concerned about the fact that there were about what the additional data coders actually were. Who were they? And it's being described as peer debriefing. So there weren't additional decoders, or what's meant by peer debriefing, and I'm not sure that that's the same as a second neutral and trained eye considering the data interpretation for consistency and so on. And so if you're portraying that the research was done according to all of these things, correc is a checklist which your study should essentially be able to show it's met all of these criteria, and it sort of doesn't, or at the very least the reporting of this study could have been a lot tidier. And also it should ensure that any subsequent citation of this paper would be reflective of all of the paper's findings, not just some of them. When we look at there are a couple of examples of coding, for example. So there's something when you read it that is then coded as a biomechanical example. So, you know, somebody is saying, well, the student practitioner said to me, this would be a patient's voice, the student practitioner said to me stuff, and he mentioned the word spondylosis. I think now that what he meant was what he meant, that's a dehydration of the discs or something along those lines. He hadn't really made it obvious that that's the case at the time. And I'm thinking scoliosis, and I'm thinking that I've got a twist in the spine, and now he's also telling me that I've got dehydration of the disc. So the patient's reporting what they were thinking about when the student osteopath was trying to explain things. So the patient is reporting what they felt the osteopath meant, but this is coded as an example of the biomechanical diagnostic thinking of the student osteopath. I'm not sure that actually does mean that. So if you're coding that as a biomedical diagnosis and using that coding as an example that osteopaths do biomedical thinking, I think that could be questioned. So anyway, when you label it as biomechanical diagnosis, is there a form of bias? Is that, you know, would a different other coder have come up with that? I don't know, you'd have to think. So again, this is in the context of the use of which this summary paper of this project was put to. So the problem is with the summarizing of this, with Thompson being a lead author in that summarization. So it's not, you know, about, you know, the person's original thesis. It's about the reporting and the use of that reporting in subsequent works to back up something, which I don't think, following this whole stream, that this article shows. I don't think it backs up what they're trying to say it does. So if we look in the quotes that they do use, many of the participant quotes used are reflective of positive outcomes from the patient's perspectives. So the words used by student osteopaths, in fact, the patients reported that this led to positive feelings within them, positive outcomes from the patient's perspectives. So why are only negative views, which are actually fewer in number in terms of so there are reporting of the negative views. Now, actually, so in the paper, they've quoted a number of things. You look at those and you say, well, that's a positive view, that's a negative view, that's a positive view, that's a negative view. Negative views meaning that the patient was disempowered by that form of words used by the student practitioner. But then there's an example where the patient was empowered by the choice of words of the student practitioner. Anyway, so if you look at the number they chose to put on their paper, they picked out some, they wrote them down, and in fact, the way that I'm reading of it, there were fewer examples of the student practitioner's words disabling people or disempowering people, and there were more examples of words used by the student osteopaths that showed a positive outcome. So why is that aspect of the conclusion that is only then being taken forwards to be used to say that there is a weak theoretical basis in osteopathy and inherent biomedicalism, because osteopaths talking about body bits to people disable them? If you actually look at the majority of the reported, the bits that they've chosen to pick out and put down in this summary paper, the majority of those reported negative outcomes in the project, etc., are to do with adverse outcomes perceived by the patients regarding tutors' words. So they, for example, if the patient was sitting there listening to the tutor discuss things with the student, the patient was listening to the tutor's words to the student, and the patient was thinking, hang on, I don't like the way the tutor's saying those things. So actually, they're reporting things which are not the impact of the student's words to the patient. And the whole premise of the paper is that it was about the hang on. The whole premise of the paper is about a qualitative study of chronic low back pain patients' interpretation of the language used by student osteopaths. So they're reporting the impact of words which were not those of the student osteopaths, and those words not by the student osteopath seem to be taking quite a prominent place, and I wonder why. So it may be very interesting, but as I said, it's not the stated population for the study, and so really I think that seems to be a trail of poor, inaccurate reporting of essentially one's own work, in the sense that one of the authors was the primary author of that summary work that was then cited in the What's Wrong work. So, you know, there may be very reasonable explanations about all of these things, but the whole reason of a critical appraisal is to say, well, you know, what's going on with all of this trail of citations, and is the evidence stacking up, and is it all revealing what they say it's revealing, and is it proving their logic? Is it proving the truths of what they say? And I just don't know that it is. There's another one, mono-interventionism. This is another problem. And so again, I don't think it's proven, but you know, it's essentially, it's about, well, osteopaths only use hands-on, and so if you only use hands-on, it's you know, that can't be right. So because you can't plausibly tell anything about a person's social world, etc., through touch alone, touch on their body, it's a naive stance. So if you're only doing this tweaking, there's whole vast tracts of relevant things as to why the patient is not recovering that you're not investigating. But so if you accept that osteopaths only just walk in the door, prod people and walk out the door, if you accept that is what osteopathy is and what osteopaths do, then you might be able to say it is mono-interventionalism. But osteopaths, they take a case history, osteopaths talk to patients, osteopaths enact with them, osteopaths enter into a negotiated contract of care, osteopaths empower, enable, inform, support. There is inactive inference, there is a therapeutic alliance. All of this is done alongside, within, through, as a result of, etc., the medium of inclusion of hands-on. So it's certainly naive, I think, to reduce all of osteopathic practice into the hands-on only element. So even if they think that's what some osteopaths only do that version of osteopathy, in other words, if they really do think that there is evidence that some osteopaths just walk in, push prod and then walk away, they also recognise through other work that they've done that they recognise that others don't do that, so they can't have it both ways. So I don't think that there is evidence, conclusive evidence, that osteopathy is a mono-interventionalistic thing. As I've said elsewhere, if we feel there is a value in using the hands-on part, if we get something from if we get a clinically relevant, important piece of knowledge from the use of hands-on interactions, and patients value that interaction as well, how can you then say that you should exclude all of that because touch is a mono-interventionism? It's only one thing. But if you get, and the patient gets a load of very useful things from that, the fact that we use a one modality to get really interesting things, why does that have to be criticized? We can get lots of other things through lots of other methods, but why is a version of getting at knowing and knowledge, a type of knowledge, why does that have to be so bad? If we have a predominantly hands-on special method of knowing, that does not, I think, prove that that is accompanied by all the negative aspects of mono-interventionalism that they are trying to put on it. So this practitioner-centered stuff, as we said already before, you know, if we touch people, we do it for our own purposes and it's got nothing to do with the patient. But I think that we are actively using that touch to do something with the patient, which then becomes empowering, and it is not the only thing that we do. And we do many other things as well. So I simply don't see that they have proven that we are a practitioner-centered dynamic. I think there's full of holes, that statement. They also seem to come at this whole story about, through mono-interventionism and practitioner-centeredness and inherent biomedicalism, they sort of, you know, it's all sort of somehow conflated and it's mixed in with this dynamic of some comments that they make about practice knowledge and expert practice and expert knowledge. And so, as we said, technical, rational stuff or capabilities, what is clinical osteopathic expertise made up of? Are the authors aware of all the literature in osteopathy in this field? So they say that traditionally clinical osteopathic expertise is predicated upon the mastery of discrete technical skills and the acquisition of biomedical knowledge, and that this seems at odds with current theories of expertise which centre on self-reflexivity and critical evaluation of practice knowledge. So they seem to be saying osteopaths don't use self-reflection and they don't use critical evaluation in practice. Also, they seem to quote, they're quoting Petty, which looks a lot at practice setting, and they're seeing somehow in amongst this, I think there's this comment that about if osteopaths are doing ideation and they're looking at anatomy and they have a postural model, that they're somehow looking for patterns in the posture, and that the fact that they're using patterns is again somehow a reductionist problematic thing. And that pattern recognition is something that's usually done in a technical, rational model. Whereas they're quoting the Petty paper, but actually the Petty paper seems to say that, you know, pattern recognition per se isn't necessarily a problem. It's got much more to do with your practice environment that might lead you to reducing your self-reflective abilities and not deploying them in practice because you simply haven't got time to do them, and you only got time to do a quick technical rational assessment. So it's practice environment which compromises practice, not your knowing of what practice knowledge should be constructed from. Anyway, so they're saying that you know, osteopaths should use self-reflection. They're saying osteopaths use anatomy. Anatomy is reductionist. Anatomy is biomedicalism. Biomedicalism. Anatomy focus leads to a technical focus on practice only, which is bad because you should be using self-reflection. So again, as I say, they're quoting this Petty paper, and you know, within that there's lots of, you know, quoting of each other's, you know, work, and Petty quotes Thompson and so on. Anyway, but what is Petty saying? Because there seems to be this sort of loose thread that somewhere in amongst all of the things that they're trying to say is that you know, osteopathic practice, you need to be more aware of how you should construct patient knowledge, and patient knowledge should be constructed in a reflexive manner, and so on. So they use in amongst all of this, they're using this reference, this Petty reference. So let's just drill into that again as another example. So anyway, this is a 2015 paper. It's discussing research of physiotherapy practice, but it's being used to comment about osteopathic practice. So it may not be relevant to osteopathic practice, but the Petty paper, although it's about physiotherapy practice, does seem to quote some papers which purport to discuss research into osteopathic clinical reasoning. Now, it does say that actually physiotherapists are equally variable in their expertise, as the study which they're citing, which reportedly looked at osteopathic expertise. So What's Wrong is quoting this paper, saying that osteopaths should be more self-reflexive, and they're somehow implying that it's peculiarly problematic that osteopaths, because of their inherent biomedicalism, are not self-reflective. So they're seeming to say that they feel that as they have acknowledged all osteopaths to be inherently biomedical, that accordingly no osteopaths use self-reflection, and that this is a peculiarly osteopathic problem, not that other professions are not bedeviled with. Then they cite, in amongst this, they cite Petty. Petty says physios are all over the place in this anyway, and Petty quotes a paper about osteopathic research, and that osteopathic research is equally problematic, not generalizable, and not showing all of the things about clinical reasoning. So some of the constructs that Thompson's paper on 12 non-representative osteopaths about you know, their osteopathic work, Thompson has used that work to consider questions of clinical reasoning and the nature of clinical reasoning and osteopathic epistemology. That work has said that there is a variable amount of both not much reflection and lots of reflection used, but the whole thing gets very problematic. They're quoting the particular paper that they're quoting is they quote this particular paper, which is underpinned by the original Thompson thesis. So when they're again, I think there's a poor chain of representation across what each of these studies did actually show. So they're picking bits and pieces of it out as though it showed an angle, which then supports the argument that they're using in the most latter work. But I don't think they should have represented their own work in that way, or the works that they're citing, I think they are not fully representing those works. And so I think it weakens their position. And anyway, they are using this petty paper to say clinical osteopathic expertise is predicated upon the mastery of discrete technical skills and the acquisition of biomedical knowledge. They quote a paper, quoting a paper, but the paper that they quote says that the clinical practice in osteopathy is a continuum from technical rationality to professional artistry. So this paper says that, by Thompson, Petty and Moore, says that there is a continuum from technical rationality to professional artistry, whereas all of a sudden it's being the clinical expertise has been found to be discrete technical skills and the acquisition of biomedical knowledge. Isn't that a misquote? There's a cross-translation issue there, isn't there? Why have they changed what their own work has said? I don't understand that. So therefore, I'm just wondering about that. But anyway, even, if it is professional artistry, technical rationality, yes. We've already said that you have procedural knowledge and that you have to have professional knowledge and you have to have experiential knowledge for clinical case analysis. And yes, within that, there are technical skills, etc. and so on. But to end it, even at professional artistry, I think that the whole discussion in these papers and this train of thought, I think, means that they don't necessarily have a full understanding of the whole literature in terms of what is expert practice, what is competence, what is clinical decision making all up about. Because I think that they, things have moved on from the positions in the papers that they've quoted. Well, it moved on before they started discussing them in papers that they've been quoting. There's a whole dynamic of capability, so that professional artistry is one thing, but actually how you should perform in practice is about what capabilities you have. And your standards of practice, which they were so concerned about very originally, are oriented upon capabilities, so that your expert practice, your capabilities might have some foundational technical rational practice within them, but essentially now, as we are regulated by standards which are set oriented to capabilities in practice, not mere professional artistry. Capabilities are something sort of more and in addition, and I think Petty and Thompson should have known more about these things, and I think that they're underinformed, and they go on about the GOSC standards of practice. They go on about the Osteopathic Board of Australia's standards of practice, and the Osteopathic Council of New Zealand, etc. Those standards of practice, they're actually called capabilities of osteopathic practice. They were derived from groups of osteopaths in those areas, and they were informed by many medical educational and many medical education experts, bringing currency to the knowledge and understanding of how these capabilities were constructed using best practice at that time, and capabilities being a model which has superseded these other models. Those standards, which they say we have been oriented to and are obliged to orient to, they were developed from this capabilities practice. And I know because I did it. I did that research project. I conceived it. I got engagement with the University of Technology, Sydney. I engaged with the various professions. I led a project which then collected a lot of experts outside osteopathy, and we got a whole bunch of people together to develop capabilities for osteopathic practice. And you can read all about it in various different references. So I went through in all sorts of various reports and papers based on of that work, which seemingly is dismissed because it was in 2011, and have you done nothing since? But in that was discussed a whole host of dynamics and how capabilities are much more relevant, and it's a better frame, and that in fact the standards of practice used in a number of places are based on this, and they should and could and did actually know about it, but have chosen to quote things which refer through to a lesser form of knowing about what is practice knowledge, clinical analysis, and all of those types of things. So I think that they are not they're not referring to a sufficiently broad perspective of literature in these matters. So the conclusions that they're making, I think, that they're following too narrow a field, which is problematic. So anyway, as I said, all of this it is immersed in some of the things that they're trying to say about practitioner-centeredness and so on. And where they've said in the past, where they've taken a contrary view through all of their own works, they one minute they're saying they're not patient-centered, one minute they're saying that they are, and that they're in the sections that they're going on about this. So in many parts of the world, osteopathy is considered to be a patient-centered approach to healthcare. They have 6 citations, and this claim may be used to differentiate the osteopathic profession from other health professions, including medicine. There's another citation. Some declare that it's a patient-centered approach is a hallmark of osteopathy, and others claim that it is the profession's distinct contribution to the wider system of healthcare. As a citation. In these 2 sentences, Thompson gives 9 citation where osteopathy is located in a patient-centered practice. And all of those references are based on, that do indicate that it is derived within and is illustrative of a patient-centered practice. So you then cannot say that osteopathy is simply a practitioner-centered dynamic, because I think they've disproved their own argument. And what are those citations? So World Health Organization benchmarks for training in osteopathy, which the UCO should be aligned to anyway. So if it's not, why isn't it? It's the GOSC, what is osteopathy, a conversation, and that's actually not now on the GOSC website, but they reference it. They quote the Osteopathy Board of Australia Osteopathic Code of Conduct, which was the Osteopathic Code of Conduct was based on the whole capabilities project that I did, and they've since just only very recently had another iteration to slightly adapt that. So it's recently been changed, but there's a previous iteration is the one that was quoted was based on the project that I did, as I said, about capabilities and so on. And that they reference the capabilities of osteopathic practice from the Osteopathic Council of New Zealand. Yes, that's the one that I did again. But then what else do they quote? They don't quote me, but they quote these other things. They quote Butler, the patient encounter, and they quote foundations They don't give a page number, which is practice, but they're quoting the fact that they're quoting this reference in 2010 is interesting anyway. But so they don't give the page number, so we don't quite know what they're trying to say that what that version says, but they're using it to obviously say that people are saying osteopathy is patient-centered. But now obviously foundations of osteopathic practice is well known. It's periodically republished and updated. Now here in 2012 is Thompson citing an updated version of Wardle Foundations, where Butler is locating osteopathy and patient-centered practice. So Butler is writing within this book, but they're using the 2010 version, but they already know that there's a 2012 version, yet they've somehow not chosen to use later iterations. They're going with the earlier ones, so he can use a citation that relates to non-patient centeredness. I don't know. There's some contradiction going on here which needs further unpicking, and I don't know how clean that makes their reporting. So it's included in GOSC practice standards. So is Thompson trying to suggest that in the What's Wrong commentary that as he contends that osteopathy is not patient-centered, that all UK osteopaths are therefore not practicing in accordance with the required standards and that therefore are either incompetent or not fit to practice? They also quote Howell, The Paradox of Osteopathy. Again, they quote Bates in the 2010 dynamic, and elsewhere, Thompson refers to the more recent version of Ward. So why is he continuing to only use the 2010 version? Obviously, he then quotes me, but in my Science and the Art of Osteopathy book. And anyway, I must say that Thompson has wrongly cited this work as I am the sole author, not the editor. It's a bit of poor proofreading there, but anyway, minor point. Yeah. And one thing that struck me, you know, towards the end of sort of reading all of these bits and bobs, is that there seems to be an issue with the fact that there must be an osteopathic version of patient-centeredness. So unless there is an osteopathic version of patient-centeredness, which is different from all the other practices or professions' version of patient-centeredness, then somehow that means that we are therefore never going to be patient-centered. Something like that seems to be implied. There seems to be a call for an osteopathic version. Does there have to be an osteopathic version? Do any other professions have a profession-specific version? So they might have ways in which they utilize a patient-centeredness, but that's not the same. There's an unclarity around whether the osteopathic application of biopsychosocial dynamics in practice and whether they have to be uniquely different to other disciplines. I don't know, because I think things about the therapeutic alliance are common between them. So why does there have to be an osteopathic version? And that's not the same question as asking osteopaths what they think biopsychosocial dynamics and patient-centeredness means to them. It's in the application of patient-centeredness. Are we not all centering around patients in a common way? I don't know. Anyway. And finally, a few comments about the predilection for implausible mechanisms. And I'm not going to unpick this because this has been a very long talk anyway. And I just wanted to pick up one. You know, early on, there were things from Sutherland which talked about cranial sutures, and Magoon went on about it, but then Sutherland went off in a different direction. But anyway, it seemed to be that they've picked up that, you know, osteopaths still only go on about cranial sutures or maybe energy, and that osteopaths still do that. So therefore they're clinging on to an implausible mechanism about suture movement, and can osteopaths do anything with suture movements? And they just don't accept, or they don't state, they don't refer to the fact of any emerging, ongoing, developing debate about whether there are new mechanisms. So they only say that the original ones are the only ones osteopaths still refer to, and as those are implausible, therefore osteopathy is still implausible, but they're not considering whether there is now different considerations and debate in osteopathy about whether there are different dynamics operating as mechanisms within what osteopaths do to heads, for example. So I just wanted to put 2 examples up of ongoing debates about bioelectrical dynamics, CV4s, and slow rhythmic oscillations in the head, and that phenomenology and all sorts of things. And I think those 2 papers are really interesting anyway, but they're there to show that there's ongoing debate and that there are osteopathic understandings which aren't those now which the What's Wrong paper seems to constrict osteopaths by. So I don't know, I feel the outcome of this review, which I'm hoping has helped you understand the process, I feel that there are lots of challenges to each of the problems that they've identified. I think that there is disproving or challenging of those assumptions on which they've built those premises, and I do then think that there's a rendering of them as being somewhat inaccurate and inappropriate and poorly founded, and I just think their literature maybe seems poor and potentially biased, and that we just have to think about all of these things. But I think that there are legitimate questions about all of these things, and you know, maybe their commentary should be withdrawn because of its flaws, and lack of reasonableness and low reliability and strong unreliability. And if you agree with those views or that interpretation of what they've written, you know, calling for them to be withdrawn, you know, could be reasonable. And if you disagree with everything that I've considered, and if you disagree with this interpretation, that's entirely fine, and you must decide your view. So I'm hoping that in illustrating going through a process, and therefore illustrating how that process has led me to have questions, you know, I'm hoping that you've got some insight into a way of doing it. I'm sure other people are much more skilled at this than me, and you know, more skilled people may come up with more things, but this is a process that has led me to have concerns in this work and in the problems it's found and in the call for action that it's made. And you know, I do wonder whether it's representative of the community of osteopaths that we are all part of. And you know, if you agree with it all, then the profession should follow the call for action as stated in there. And if it's the latter, if you don't agree, then certainly something emancipatory from their power and politics and call for action, something emancipatory from that is definitely overdue. There we go. Thank you very much.